In the heart of Mexico, a magnificent city floated on a lake, the center of an empire built on war and prophecy. But in 1519, its doom arrived from across the sea, sparking a brutal clash of worlds that would bring one of the greatest civilizations in history to its knees. In the heart of Mexico City, a crew of electrical workers was breaking through the tough asphalt of a residential street on the evening of February 21, 1978. Their task was straightforward: lay new electrical cables throughout the neighborhood, a job that felt completely ordinary at the start. Everything changed when their equipment, digging just a couple of meters down, hit a massive, unyielding object. They had uncovered a gigantic slab of stone. As they carefully cleared away the surrounding dirt, they revealed elaborate and complex carvings covering its surface. Recognizing the potential significance, they immediately contacted archaeologists from the National Institute of History and Anthropology, which brought all local construction to a halt. Teams of archaeologists swarmed the site, beginning a dedicated excavation to identify the mysterious artifact. With each layer of earth they removed, the object's identity grew more certain. It was a circular stone monument, more than 3 meters across. Its face depicted a powerful image, a naked and dismembered goddess, adorned with a feathered crown and encircled by motifs of snakes and skulls. Experts identified the figure as the goddess Coyolxauhqui, a deity revered by the ancient civilization we now know as the Aztecs. Finding this incredible relic ignited a national fascination with the city's hidden past. The excitement was so great that Mexico's president decreed that the whole city block be cleared for a full-scale archaeological dig, resulting in the demolition of 13 buildings. The archaeologists' excitement grew with every new find. They soon realized the stone disk was strategically placed at the bottom of a colossal staircase, which once ascended to a platform holding the remains of a great pyramid. This structure was no less than the main temple of Tenochtitlan, a legendary city long buried and forgotten beneath modern Mexico City. This lost metropolis had been the vibrant center of a vast and powerful empire. For the next 4 years, the dig continued. Day after day, residents gathered to witness the astonishing sight of an ancient civilization emerging from the ground they walked on every day. Gazing at the spectacle, they surely pondered who these people were and how they had created such phenomenal structures on the very land beneath their feet. To truly understand the story of this land, we have to go back much, much further in time. The end of a world is a profound concept, but for the ground beneath modern-day Mexico City, it was a recurring theme. Let's journey back 66 million years, to a time when Earth was an entirely different planet, an alien world ruled by the massive reptiles we now call dinosaurs. Imagine a landscape covered not with cities and fields, but with sprawling ferns and vast swamps, punctuated by towering, ancient pine forests. Small winged pterodactyls would have filled the skies, while below the great horned triceratops roamed the open plains. Hidden within the forests, deadly packs of velociraptors stalked their prey, and the colossal Tyrannosaurus crashed through the undergrowth. Yet the sky held the most spectacular creature of all, the Quetzalcoatlus, the biggest animal to ever take flight. Its wingspan stretched over 15 meters, dwarfing even a modern-day fighter jet. Their immense size meant they seldom touched the ground, instead spending their lives riding warm air currents that rose from the ocean, undertaking epic migrations across an Atlantic Ocean that was only about half as wide as it is today. Then one day, a new light appeared in the heavens. It began as a faint speck, but with each passing day, it grew in brilliance. In just a day or two, this object would have blazed like a second sun in the sky. Suddenly, a searing flash of light illuminated the whole western hemisphere. Faster than a blink of an eye, an asteroid 11 kilometers wide, roughly the size of Mount Everest, slammed into the planet right on the coastline of what is now southern Mexico. The impact unleashed an inconceivable amount of energy, somewhere around 100 million megatons, which is like setting off the combined nuclear arsenals of the entire modern world all at once. An explosion with the force of the world's entire nuclear arsenal detonating all at once, repeated 15,000 times. Near the impact site, the very ground would have behaved like liquid, rippling under the force of an earthquake registering a staggering magnitude 10. In an instant, the asteroid itself ceased to be solid rock, transforming into a sphere of superheated plasma exceeding 10,000 degrees Celsius, a temperature twice that of the Sun's surface. Hurricane-force winds screaming at over 1,000 kilometers an hour scoured the continent, while colossal tsunamis, reaching 200 meters in height, crashed against the shorelines and surged as far as 100 kilometers inland. As superheated debris rained back down, wildfires erupted across the globe. Vast plumes of vaporized rock dust then enveloped the planet, creating a dark shroud that would blot out the sun for years. In some parts of the world, the sky even rained down tiny pellets of glass. This single event would prove unsurvivable for most of life on Earth. Every large dinosaur, from the tyrannosaurs and triceratops to the enormous flying Quetzalcoatlus, was driven into extinction. The botanical devastation was just as severe, with more than half of all plant species in North America wiped out. For years, the only things that could grow were mushrooms and other fungi, feasting on the decaying matter of the planet's fallen forests. Only smaller land animals that could burrow deep into the ground, like snakes, lizards, and snails, managed to survive. Scurrying through the dust and ruins of this shattered world were also tiny, rat-sized mammals, the distant ancestors of every human being alive today. Even now, traces of this cataclysm remain. A vast, circular crater, 150 kilometers in diameter, is still detectable around the modern town of Chicxulub in southern Mexico, marking the spot where a hole several kilometers deep was torn into the planet's crust. In the 66 million years that followed, the Earth continued its slow, dramatic transformation. For more than 100 million years, the tectonic plates had already been grinding against one another, causing the American continents to drift away from the supercontinent of Europe and Africa. Far back in time, a land bridge connected the continents, making it possible to walk from Nigeria to Brazil, from Morocco to New York, or from Spain to Canada. By this point, however, the planet was divided into two major landmasses: Afro-Eurasia, which included Africa, Europe, and Asia, and the separate continents of the Americas. This movement is powered by immense currents of molten rock circulating within the planet's mantle, which continuously tear the Earth's crust apart along the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. As this happens, the North and South American continents are pushed westwards at roughly the same speed your fingernails grow. Since the time of the Chicxulub impact, this slow, steady drift has widened the Atlantic Ocean by approximately 1,300 kilometers. The entire western coast of the Americas, from Alaska down through California and Mexico, and all the way to Chile, represents the leading edge of these moving continental plates. As these plates advance west, they slide over the Pacific Ocean floor, forcing it downwards. This process crumples the continental edge, pushing up immense mountain ranges like the Rockies in the north and the Andes in the south. The titanic forces at play make this entire coastal region a hotspot for both earthquakes and volcanoes. These volcanoes, in particular, define the landscape of modern Mexico. In the country's south, a chain known as the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt has erupted over the past 20 million years, creating a stunning series of snow-capped peaks. The space between these mountains has filled with layers of solidified lava, forming a high-altitude plateau. Today, we know this area as the Valley of Mexico. This dramatic landscape is a high-altitude basin, sitting over 2,000 meters above sea level and ringed by towering active volcanoes that can soar up to 6,000 meters. The valley floor is blessed with fertile land and a plentiful supply of water. Rain and snowmelt from the mountain peaks cascade down the slopes, forming rivers that collect in the basin to create an enormous body of water known as Lake Texcoco. This was a truly immense lake, stretching roughly 80 kilometers in length and 40 kilometers in width. Its shores were defined by vast marshlands of reeds and rushes, and during the winter, it became a haven for migratory birds traveling from as far north as Canada to escape the cold. In the 66 million years since the Chicxulub asteroid impact, the small, rodent-like creatures that survived that cataclysm had also undergone some radical changes. Their evolution, as gradual and unstoppable as the shifting continents, had proceeded generation by generation. Over eons, they had branched out into the incredible variety of mammals that inhabit the world today. Horses, for instance, first evolved in North America around 3.5 million years ago. During periods when sea levels were low, they crossed into eastern Russia and from there spread across the Afro-Eurasian landmass. This migration was not a one-way street, as other animals made the journey in the opposite direction. Enormous Columbian mammoths, massive beasts weighing over 10 tons, trekked from Asia into the Americas, eventually migrating as far south as Mexico. The last time low sea levels made this possible was during the last ice age, which began about 33,000 years ago, revealing a land bridge between Asia and the Americas. Following the trail of the mammoths, humans used this very bridge to cross into the Americas. They journeyed southward, establishing Stone Age cultures as they went, and are thought to have arrived in the Valley of Mexico around 12,000 years ago. Around this same time, a combination of climate change, collapsing ecosystems, and possible human hunting led to the extinction of the horse in the Americas. Then, about 10,000 years ago, the last ice age concluded. The seas rose, and the land bridge between the continents vanished beneath the waves forever. With their natural path gone, horses would not return to the Americas. The human populations of the Old and New Worlds were now completely isolated, destined to develop in parallel until their eventual and fateful reunion. In the Valley of Mexico, the story begins with nomadic hunter-gatherers. Along the shores of Lake Texcoco, they discovered pine forests teeming with huge herds of mammoths. Over thousands of years, their persistent hunting drove these colossal creatures to extinction, and to this day, the valley's soil is filled with their fossilized remains. Roughly 7,000 years ago, a shift to agriculture occurred, as people learned to harness the lake's natural flood cycles for farming. This new stability allowed different cultures to flourish, gradually merging into ever larger communities. By 1200 BC, this process had culminated in the emergence of sizable villages dotting the valley's landscape. Meanwhile, the lands to the north were harsh and dry, eventually giving way to the scorching Chihuahua Desert. The difficulty of survival in this arid environment pushed wave after wave of migrating tribes southward. These groups were drawn to the Valley of Mexico, a lush oasis with abundant water and food. As fledgling settlements grew, this constant influx of newcomers caused the population to surge, fostering a rich blend of cultures and paving the way for more complex societies. The dawn of the first millennium saw the birth of the region's first true cities. Among them, one city in particular, known as Teotihuacan, would achieve extraordinary scale and influence. Its inhabitants constructed a magnificent capital featuring immense pyramids and grand avenues, and they also controlled the trade of a rare, valuable green obsidian unique to their territory. Teotihuacan's power was felt across great distances, extending deep into Central America and even meddling in the affairs of the powerful Mayan kingdoms. Despite its immense regional impact, the identity of its people remains a profound mystery. We are unsure of their origins, their language, or what ultimately caused their civilization to vanish. Archaeological evidence reveals a catastrophic event around 550 AD, when the city's temples and palaces were systematically burned. This triggered a rapid decline, leaving its once mighty pyramids to crumble. Yet, the city's cultural shadow was long-lasting. Much like the ancient Greeks for Europe, Teotihuacan became a foundational influence, shaping the art, religion, and societies of all the civilizations that followed. Continuing this analogy, if Teotihuacan represented the Greeks, then the Toltecs were Mesoamerica's Romans. In the power vacuum left by Teotihuacan's collapse and the decline of the southern Mayan cities, the Toltec Empire rose to become the dominant power in Central America, governing from their capital of Tula. Mirroring Rome's reverence for Greek culture, the Toltecs consciously emulated the grand civilization of Teotihuacan. The language they spoke, Nahuatl, would soon become the common tongue throughout the region. Their reputation as master craftsmen and artisans was so profound that in the Nahuatl language itself, the very word Toltec evolved to become a synonym for artist. However, for reasons still debated by historians, their capital of Tula was eventually abandoned, and the Toltec Empire dissolved, following its predecessor into ruin. The fall of the Toltecs sets the stage for the rise of our main subjects, but before we meet them, it's crucial to understand how we know what we know about this period. Understanding this period requires navigating a fascinating but complex web of historical sources. We have a surprisingly rich collection of accounts, many from the Mexica people themselves. The name they actually used, as the word Aztec, is a more recent label. These individuals witnessed life before Europeans ever arrived. The main challenge for historians, however, is that these first-hand reports were only recorded long after the conquest, often with decades separating the memory from the event itself. A central figure in this preservation effort was Bernardo de Sahagún, a Spanish churchman often regarded as the world's first anthropologist. Arriving in Mexico in 1529, he dedicated the following 5 decades of his life to a deep study of Mexica history and culture, which included mastering their language, Nahuatl. 30 years after the initial Spanish arrival, during the 1550s, Sahagún began a monumental project. He sought out elderly Mexica survivors who could still recall their world before the conquest, meticulously recording their memories into a remarkable volume titled A General History of the Things of New Spain, also known as the Historia General. Within this work lies its most celebrated component, the Florentine Codex. This massive manuscript spans 2,400 pages across 12 books, brought to life with more than 2,500 illustrations created by native artists. Crucially, Sahagún documented everything bilingually, writing the text in both the indigenous Nahuatl and Spanish. While the Florentine Codex provides an unparalleled look into Mexica culture, religion, and society, we must consider that it was compiled under the direction of a European priest with his own biases. Furthermore, his interview subjects were recalling distant memories, and it's uncertain if their accounts were influenced by a desire to please their European recorder, complicating its reliability. Fray Diego Duran, a Dominican monk, represents another vital chronicler of the Mexica world. Unlike most of his European contemporaries, Duran became a fluent Nahuatl speaker after being raised by indigenous servants from a young age. He authored a book titled The History of the Indies of New Spain, but it remained unpublished in his lifetime, as he endured harsh criticism from fellow Spaniards who felt he was overly sympathetic to the native population. Later in the 16th century, a few indigenous men also began recording their own histories. One such figure was Don Fernando de Alva Ixtloxochitl, a descendant of the final king of the city-state of Texcoco. His unique advantage was access to original Mexica books that his family had successfully hidden from the Spanish. These sources, each valuable yet partial and potentially flawed, are what historians must work with. Attempting to reconstruct a definitive truth from them can feel like wandering through a maze of distorted reflections. However, by cross-referencing these written accounts with physical archaeological discoveries, a clearer picture of the major events leading to the Mexica's rise begins to form. Our story truly gets underway around the year 1300 AD. At this point in history, the Valley of Mexico was a transformed landscape. While the monumental ruins of Teotihuacan and the Toltecs were still visible, slowly decaying back into the soil, a new power structure had emerged. The numerous small villages that once dotted the lake's edge had since blossomed into formidable, independent city-states, each centered around its own cluster of towering pyramid temples. The lake itself was a bustling highway, constantly traversed by a dense network of canoes, with some large enough to carry 30 people, ferrying goods between the vibrant city markets. The political situation had also shifted profoundly. Following the collapse of the Toltecs, a power vacuum had opened, which was decisively filled by a group called the Tepenecs. From their capital city of Azcapotzalco, situated on the western shore of the lake, they established dominance over the valley's other communities. Their burgeoning empire was already formidable, commanding tribute from no fewer than 40 surrounding cities. But how did this mighty empire come to be? To understand their incredible rise, we have to travel back about 2 centuries, to around 1300 AD, when a new band of migrants first arrived in the valley. The local inhabitants referred to these newcomers as Chichimecas, a Nahuatl term for barbarians or savages, often used for nomadic tribes that wandered in from the northern deserts. This particular group told stories of a mythical homeland, a mysterious place no one had heard of called Aztlan, from which they claimed they were forced to escape. According to their tales, they had spent years wandering the harsh deserts in search of a new home. While they identified themselves as the Mexica, history would later know them by a name derived from that mysterious place of origin, the Aztecs. Imagine the awe of these exhausted travelers as they finally crested the hills, gazing down upon the vast, green expanse of the Valley of Mexico for the first time. The sight of cities glittering like jewels around the Great Lake must have filled them with hope that their long search was over. In such a plentiful land, they surely believed a place to settle was within reach, a belief that would quickly prove mistaken. Unfortunately for them, the valley was already crowded, its population swelled by generations of migration. Every desirable piece of territory had been claimed by an existing city-state, and the established residents turned the Mexica away at every turn. Their reception wasn't helped by the fact that the Mexica were, by all accounts, a rugged and unrefined group. Lacking the sophisticated manners and embroidered clothing of the urbanites, their toughness had been forged through years of survival in the wilderness. They also worshipped a formidable, warlike deity named Huitzilopochtli, which translates to hummingbird of the south. Though no city would grant them land, the locals did recognize one valuable asset the Mexica possessed: their ferocity. Several city-states began offering them food in return for their service as mercenaries. For years, these nomads roamed the valley, selling their fighting skills to the highest bidder and perishing in conflicts that were not their own, all while dreaming of a permanent home. Following roughly 25 years as soldiers for hire, the Mexica came to a stark realization. If they wanted a home, they would need to create it themselves. Only one location in the entire valley remained unclaimed, a testament to its undesirability. This last scrap of land was a marshy, inhospitable island situated in the waters of Lake Texcoco, near its western shore. Using canoes, the Mexica made their way out to this desolate spot. On that soggy ground, they erected a few simple huts and fashioned a humble altar of reeds for their god, Huitzilopochtli. From these modest beginnings, they finally had a place to call their own. They couldn't have known it at the time, but this tiny swamp settlement was destined to become one of the world's most magnificent cities within just 2 centuries. The Mexica gave their new home a name to honor a legendary leader, Tenoch, who had guided them on their long journey. The city, therefore, was called Tenochtitlan. In its early days, Tenochtitlan's growth was slow. The space provided by the original island was quickly filled by the first few huts and a rising population, forcing the Mexica to devise an ingenious solution. Their answer was to create new land by building artificial islands. Paddling canoes into the shallows, they drove long stakes into the lakebed to form enclosures, which they then filled with earth until solid ground emerged from the water. A chaotic network of these man-made plots, linked by canals and bridges, began to spread outward from the original core, fueling the city's expansion. A visitor returning a century later, in the early decades of the 1400s, would have found the city utterly transformed. The once humble settlement now resembled a grand metropolis like Venice, a sprawling network of islands and waterways now connected to the mainland. The city's connections to the mainland were 3 immense causeways extending north, south, and west. For nighttime security, these were ingeniously designed with sections of wooden drawbridges that could be raised. Looking east provided a sweeping view across the Great Lake, where on a clear day, the shores of the city of Texcoco were just visible in the distance. Surrounding Tenochtitlan was a remarkable agricultural system of man-made island gardens known as chinempas. The Mexica engineered these fertile plots by first weaving reeds and sticks into underwater fences, and then backfilling the enclosed space with nutrient-rich earth. These floating gardens were used to cultivate an incredible variety of crops, from staples like maize, beans, and squash, to tomatoes, chili peppers, and even beautiful decorative flowers. Farmers navigated the canals between these chinempas in canoes, transporting tools and young plants out, and returning with baskets brimming with harvested produce. The lake itself offered more than just a place to build. Since numerous mountain springs flowed into Lake Texcoco, its waters had a significant salt content, allowing salt production to flourish as a vital local industry. A Spanish observer from the 16th century, Pedro Martir, documented this practice, noting how the Mexica channeled the salty lake water into special ditches to thicken it. He wrote that they would then boil this concentrated brine and form it into loaves and balls to be traded at markets. Crucially, he observed that only loyal subjects of the Aztec king were permitted access to this salt, never those who defied his authority. Beyond farming, the Mexica also relied on fishing and hunting. The Spanish visitor Ortiz de Montellano was stunned by the sheer number of migratory birds, particularly geese, that filled the area during winter months. He recalled seeing such great multitudes on the lagoon that in some places it seemed like a solid lake made entirely of birds, from which the locals harvested many. The Mexica diet was also supplemented by other unique protein sources. Several insect species were on the menu, including a type of marsh fly they called the Toxcatl. Hernando Fernandez, another Spanish writer of the era, described how this food was prepared. He explained that the small flies were collected from the lake with nets in such huge quantities that they could be mashed together into balls for sale in the markets throughout the year. To cook them, they were wrapped in corn husks and boiled in salt water, resulting in what he described as a good, abundant, and agreeable food. Other unusual delicacies included fish eggs, eaten much like caviar, and even the eggs of the Toxcatl fly itself. These eggs, known in Nahuatl as ahuatl or wheat of the water, were laid in enormous numbers on the lake's reedbeds and mudflats. The Mexica would grind them into a paste to be baked into cakes or flattened into tortillas. Both the fly and its eggs were an exceptional dietary resource, composed of 60% pure protein. For a snack, the Mexica also enjoyed a species of toasted aquatic worm called oculistac, which they seasoned with salt. Thanks to this abundance of food and their ingenious farming methods, Tenochtitlan experienced a massive population boom. Within just a century, the city swelled to house at least 200,000 people, making it larger than contemporary London or Paris. In all likelihood, it was bigger than any other city in Europe at the time. It quickly expanded to cover a rough square of roughly 3 kilometers per side, a scale of growth that would fundamentally change the Mexica people. The once scrappy band of warriors who first settled in the valley were now utterly transformed into a sophisticated and established civilization. Drawing heavily from the legacies of the Toltecs and Teotihuacan, they masterfully adopted the ancient traditions of grand pyramid construction and intricate stone carving. An influx of skilled artisans and scholars from across the valley was welcomed, bringing with them new customs and contributing to the Mexica's astonishing engineering prowess. A prime example of this skill emerged in 1418 with the start of a massive project. A 4-kilometer-long stone aqueduct that leaped across the lake on artificial islands, delivering fresh, clean water directly into the city's core. To manage their aquatic environment, the Mexica also constructed a colossal dam to shield the city from seasonal floods. Internally, Tenochtitlan was organized into distinct districts, such as Cupapan, the place where flowers bloom, to the north, and Moyotlan, the place of the gnats, to the west. At the city's ceremonial heart, the simple reed shrine of their ancestors had given way to a gigantic pyramid. This structure dominated a courtyard half a kilometer square and grew with each successive king, who would build a new layer over the existing one. This created a nested, Russian doll effect, which is why archaeologists can now find the temple's earlier versions preserved within its ruins. It was at the base of this pyramid's great stairway that the massive stone disk depicting the goddess Coyolxauhqui once lay, the very same artifact destined to be unearthed by those Mexico City electrical workers 5 centuries later. Life in Tenochtitlan also offered incredible luxuries and pleasures. The city boasted both a botanical garden and a zoo, features that would later astound Spanish visitors who had never encountered such marvels back in Europe. Yet, not all pleasures were permitted. Mexica society strictly forbade the consumption of alcohol, with public intoxication carrying severe penalties, sometimes even death. Nevertheless, it seems many people indulged anyway, drinking a milky alcoholic beverage brewed from the agave plant known as pulque. A stroll through the city might also reveal people consuming hallucinogenic mushrooms, either eaten whole or brewed into a tea. These fungi were used for recreation, but held a deeper religious meaning, especially for priests and poets. The influence of these substances is captured in surviving oral poetry, such as one verse recorded in the Florentine Codex, which reads, "I have drunk fungus wine and my heart weeps. On earth I have only pain. It matters nothing. We are all precious jewels of the god, strung on a thread. We are altogether jewels on his necklace." Perhaps one of the most spectacular sights in the entire city was located in its northern district of Tlaxcala, the Great Market. Tenochtitlan's unique position had made it the central hub for all regional trade, with countless boats arriving daily from other lakeside communities to sell their wares. An astonishingly vibrant array of foods and goods flowed into this market from every corner of the valley and distant lands. Cacao and brilliant green quetzal feathers arrived from the south, while the north supplied gold, silver, bark paper, and obsidian blades for common use. One account from the Florentine Codex catalogues the immense variety of foods served at a single Aztec feast, offering a glimpse into the diverse palate they enjoyed. The menu included white tortillas, grains of maize, turkey eggs, and the turkeys themselves. A stunning assortment of fruits was also present, such as custard apple, mamey, yellow and black sapote, sweet potato, manioc, white sweet potato, jicama, plum, jobo, guava, avocado, acacia, American cherry, and even tuna. In the bustling great market of Tlaxcala, you could also find a wide selection of clothes and textiles, all woven into the uniquely colorful patterns for which the Aztecs were famous. They offered a range of precious cloaks, with styles described as sun-colored, blue-knotted, or covered with jars. Other designs included those with painted eagles, serpent faces, wind jewels, whirlpools, smoking mirrors, or patterns colored with turkey blood. This market was a vibrant social hub, alive with constant activity. As canoe riders mingled with market sellers, they might have shared a laugh over the latest riddles, a cherished form of Aztec entertainment. Remarkably, some of these riddles have been passed down. For instance, what thing, 10 stones with something on their backs? The answer is the nails on our fingers. Another asks, what thing, white stone from which green feathers are born? This refers to an onion. And a third, what thing, a warrior in a house made of pine branches? The solution is the eye with all its lashes. Yet underneath the city's thriving energy, a much grimmer reality existed in Tenochtitlan, something that would have been immediately obvious to any visitor. A tradesman arriving at the Tlaxcala market would have found it impossible to miss the gigantic pyramid dominating the Tiapan district, topped by 2 shrines, one painted a vibrant blue, the other a deep, dark red. The blue shrine was dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain, fertility, and life, whose name meant wine of the earth. The Aztecs also worshipped other deities, like Tezcatlipoca, the god of night, and the famous Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent often imagined as a type of flying dragon. The Great Red Temple, however, was consecrated to a very different kind of god. Its ornately carved steps would have been perpetually darkened by a cascading flow of dried blood. While Mexica culture had evolved significantly over the last century, it still clung to elements of its harsh origins. This included their unwavering reverence for the fearsome hummingbird god, Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun, war, and sacrifice. For the Aztecs, Huitzilopochtli was the sun itself, locked in an eternal daily chase against his celestial siblings, the moon and the stars. Their entire cosmology was based on the belief that if his energy ever failed, this cosmic pursuit would cease, and the world would plunge into darkness. And there was only one thing that could replenish his divine strength. According to their worldview, a tiny piece of the sun was trapped within the heart of every living creature, generating the body's warmth and vitality. By surgically removing a heart and offering it in a fire, they believed they could release this trapped energy, sending it back to Huitzilopochtli. To fulfill this sacred duty, the Aztecs would sacrifice various animals they bred, like dogs, eagles, jaguars, and deer. But it is, of course, their use of human subjects that has made them so infamous. While human sacrifice for religious reasons occurred in many societies across the history of the Americas, The Mexica developed numerous methods depending on the festival. The most common ritual involved leading a victim to the summit of a Tenochtitlan pyramid and restraining them on a stone altar. A priest, wielding a razor-sharp dagger of obsidian, a volcanic glass with an edge finer than surgical steel, would slice through the diaphragm to extract the heart. A human heart's self-driving muscles mean it could keep pulsating for up to 10 minutes after being removed, as long as blood remained inside. These still-beating hearts were set in a bowl and burned, allowing their life force to ascend to the sun. The now lifeless body was then cast down the pyramid's steps, where it was often dismembered to feed the animals in the city's zoo. Certain ceremonies also incorporated acts of cannibalism. Pinpointing the exact scale of this practice is nearly impossible, thanks to a few complicating factors. Firstly, the Spanish used tales of sacrifice as a key justification for their conquest, giving them every reason to inflate the numbers. Secondly, the Mexica themselves likely exaggerated the figures in their own records. Boasting of numerous sacrifices was a display of power that could intimidate rival states. A prime example is the Mexica claim of sacrificing over 80,000 people in 1487 for a single temple's dedication. While archaeologists have found some sacrificial burial sites near temples, nothing resembling the massive graves needed for such a slaughter has ever been located. Another key detail that changes our perspective is where these victims came from. They were typically prisoners captured in battle. Aztec warfare was an intensely ritualized process. Wars were initiated with elaborate ceremonies and were strategically scheduled for the half of the year when agricultural work was slow. On the battlefield, an Aztec soldier's primary mission was not to kill his foe, but to capture him alive and bring him back to Tenochtitlan. A powerful system of rewards created a huge incentive to take enemies prisoner. Every boy from the lower classes received military training, but he wasn't considered a man until he had taken his first captive for sacrifice. Securing a second prisoner earned him privileges like wearing sandals and a feathered cloak. A warrior who captured 4 enemies was elevated to the prestigious rank of a jaguar warrior, a position comparable to a European knight who wore a real jaguar pelt. This was the only pathway for a commoner to ascend into the noble class. If a warrior continued to excel, he could achieve the ultimate rank of eagle warrior. These elites, adorned with beaked helmets and magnificent feathers, were the most formidable of all Aztec warriors. This focus on capturing has led some historians to suggest that human sacrifice simply relocated the violence of war from the battlefield to the temple pyramid. While a conventional battle elsewhere in history might result in tens of thousands of deaths, that bloodshed typically happened far from civilian eyes. Aztec warfare, in contrast, produced fewer battlefield casualties, but shifted the killing to a public stage where every citizen could witness it. Though we shouldn't downplay the day-to-day horror of this reality, it's also true that in the wider context of history, ritual sacrifice was not uniquely Aztec. An even more complex question is what the average Mexica citizen thought of these spectacles. Their feelings were probably a varied and complicated mix. For many, it might have been a blend of fear and fascination, not unlike how European peasants regarded their own gruesome, drawn-out public executions. Others may have viewed it as we see the over 1 million annual deaths from car accidents today. A profound tragedy for the individuals involved, yet a seemingly unavoidable cost for maintaining the world as we know it. No doubt some found genuine entertainment in the proceedings. Much like the ritualized slaughter of gladiators and prisoners in the Roman Colosseum, Aztec sacrifices were boisterous events that served as a stark reminder of life's fragility and the immense power of the state. The sight was a potent tool for terrifying the populace into obeying their king, while also likely providing a guilty thrill of relief in the thought, "I'm glad that isn't me." Regardless of these complex feelings, one thing was certain: the scale of human sacrifice was poised for a dramatic escalation. This impending shift was driven by a radical transformation of the political landscape in the Valley of Mexico. As the year 1400 passed, the entire region was on the verge of erupting into war. From this conflict, a king would emerge in Tenochtitlan who perfectly embodied the Mexica's martial spirit. He was destined to convert the booming island metropolis into the heart of a formidable empire, a military machine that would come to dominate the valley and far beyond. His name was Itzcoatl. The early life of Itzcoatl, whose name meant Obsidian Serpent, remains largely a mystery, though the name would prove to be an apt reflection of his character. He served as a nobleman in the court of his own nephew, the Mexica king Chimalpopoca, who had ascended to the throne at just 20 years old. While good-natured, this young king lacked crucial strength and experience. This was a dangerous time to be weak, as the Tepic people were the undisputed masters of the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan, along with every other city, was firmly under their dominion for very practical reasons. The Tepic military was a powerhouse, drawing soldiers from over 40 vassal cities. Their capital, Azcapotzalco, strategically commanded the shoreline precisely where Tenochtitlan's 3 vital causeways connected to the mainland. If the city's aqueduct ever broke, its people had to ask for Tepic permission just to bring in repair materials. As a result, Tenochtitlan kept its head down, dutifully paying tribute and contributing warriors to the Tepic's military campaigns. A significant factor in the Tepic's century of success was the incredibly long reign of their king, Tezozamac. According to Aztec records, he was already over a century old by the year 1420. The historian Fernando Ixtlahuaxtli states that King Tezozamac had ruled from Azcapotzalco for more than 50 years, painting a vivid picture of the ancient monarch. He was apparently so old he had to be carried about like an infant, wrapped in feathers and soft skins. He was brought into the sun daily to be warmed, and at night slept between 2 large braziers, never leaving their glow. His longevity was attributed to his temperate habits in eating and drinking. But neither the Tepics nor their ancient king were beloved by the other peoples of the valley. Theirs was a regime built on violence and terror. Ixtlahuaxtli did not mince words, describing Tezozamac as the most cruel man who ever lived, proud, warlike, and domineering. The Tepics maintained control over the valley's cities through a brutal combination of targeted assassinations and overwhelming military force. Any rival king who dared stand in their way could expect to find assassins with obsidian daggers creeping into his palace to slit his throat in his sleep. A full-scale invasion by the Tepic army would typically follow. As a young nobleman, Itzcoatl witnessed a chilling demonstration of this cruelty in the fate of Texcoco, a city situated on the lake's opposite shore. Texcoco was the home of a young prince named Nezahualcóatl, one of the most compelling figures in this entire history. His name, which meant hungry coyote, belied the life of absolute luxury he enjoyed in his youth. That life came to a sudden end when his father, the king of Texcoco, challenged the ambitions of the Tepic Empire. When Nezahualcóatl was only 15, Tepic assassins stormed their palace and murdered his father. The young prince managed to hide in the branches of a nearby tree, where he was forced to watch his father's slaughter unfold before his very eyes. Once it was safe, he climbed down and fled the city, which was soon occupied by a Tepic army. Following the conquest, the Tepics demanded that Tenochtitlan's weak, young king, Chimalpopoca, also send troops. In response, Tenochtitlan's armies were compelled to assist the Tepics, and together they torched the city. The young prince, Nezahualcóatl, was forced to abandon the only home he had ever known, all while mourning the loss of his father and the massacre of his people. For the next 4 years, Nezahualcóatl lived in hiding, taking on the disguise of a commoner in the mountains. He must have lived in constant fear that assassins might discover him, bringing him to the same terrible end as his father. However, it seems Tenochtitlan's young king, Chimalpopoca, experienced a surge of remorse for his role in Texcoco's downfall. He made a journey to the Tepic capital for an audience with the old King Tezozamac, hoping to plead the young prince's case. It truly paints a remarkable picture. A 20-year-old King Chimalpopoca stepping into a dimly lit room, where the ancient King Tezozamac sat wrapped in feathers and skins, huddled beside a flaming brazier for heat. One can almost hear the tremor in Chimalpopoca's voice as he begged the powerful emperor to show mercy to Prince Nezahualcóatl. He proposed that the prince be permitted to come to Tenochtitlan, where he could live peacefully and receive an education at one of the city's schools. In a surprising turn of events, King Tezozamac consented to the arrangement. As a result, the young Nezahualcóatl was able to end his mountain exile and take up residence in Tenochtitlan. He began his studies at a special school known as a comicac, an institution where the children of nobles were trained in the refined arts of high society, preparing them to be military commanders, administrators, and priests. It must have been a profoundly strange existence for the young prince, living just a short distance across the water from the home that had been violently taken from him, now governed by a puppet ruler. On a clear day, he would have been able to see his former home of Texcoco across the lake. He might have sat atop the city's towering pyramids, gazing over the water and pondering if he would ever manage to return. His decade-long stay in Tenochtitlan fostered a lifelong affection for the city and its way of life. It was during this time that his path crossed with the nobleman Itzcoatl, a man known as the Obsidian Serpent. We are not entirely sure when they first met, but it's compelling to imagine it happened during these tense times. You can almost see them navigating the crowded markets of Tlaxcala, sharing fish egg tortillas while watching canoes glide in, piled high with maize. Perhaps they strolled through the great plaza of Tiapan, quietly discussing their mutual disdain for their Tepanic overlords. It might have been in these moments that the seeds of a plan were sown, a scheme to seize the valley from the tyrannical King Tezazamak. While the path forward was unclear, the opportunity they desperately needed was fast approaching. Under King Tezazamak, the Tepanics had enjoyed an era of great prosperity. This golden age, however, came to a definitive end in 1426, when the ancient king finally passed away at the astonishing age of 106. With his death, the Tepanic Empire's stability immediately started to crumble. Tezazamak left behind many sons, and though one named Teotzin initially inherited the throne, his ambitious brother Maxla saw an opening. Maxla swiftly overthrew Teotzin, claiming the crown for himself and plunging the Tepanic lands into a violent succession crisis and a widespread civil war. The city of Tenochtitlan was unexpectedly thrust into the heart of this conflict. Its ruler, the good-natured young king Chimalpopoca, was guided by a powerful sense of justice. He chose to support the legitimate king, an act that thoroughly infuriated the usurper Maxla. A series of insults flew between the two leaders, with Maxla once sending Chimalpopoca a demeaning gift of women's clothing. Despite being about 30 years old, Chimalpopoca possessed a certain youthful idealism. This vulnerability proved fatal in 1427, when a team of assassins scaled his palace walls, crept into his bedchamber, and murdered him as he slept. While the usurper king Maxla surely celebrated this news, he failed to see he had made a catastrophic error. Chimalpopoca's assassination cleared the path for a far more formidable leader to take the throne in Tenochtitlan. This new king was Itzcoatl, and his ascension marked the beginning of the end for Tepanic dominance. Itzcoatl immediately formed a partnership with the exiled Prince Nezahualcoatl. Together, they traveled throughout the valley, rallying support for their cause and discovering widespread resentment for Tepanic rule. Aztec historical accounts claim their forces swelled to as many as 100,000 soldiers. The final blow to Maxla's confidence must have been the defection of Tlacopan, the Tepanics' most steadfast ally, which decisively shifted the balance of power. Still, Maxla was not one to surrender easily. A brutal war consumed the region for the next 2 years. The Tepanics' initial strategy was to lay siege to Tenochtitlan, believing an early capture of the island city would crush the rebellion. However, Tenochtitlan's location on the lake made it a natural fortress, perfectly suited to endure a prolonged siege. An uninterrupted flow of supplies and fresh troops arrived by canoe, allowing the city to hold firm. The siege finally broke when King Itzcoatl returned with his main army, forcing the Tepanics into a chaotic retreat that soon became a full-blown rout. In 1428, the unified armies of Itzcoatl and Nezahualcoatl pressed their advantage, marching directly on the Tepanic capital of Azcapotzalco. They surrounded the city, breached its defenses, and razed it to the ground. As for the usurper king, Maxla was captured and brought to Tenochtitlan, where he was executed atop the great temple. The age of Tepanic supremacy had ended, making way for a new authority in the valley. A decade after he had escaped as a terrified boy, Prince Nezahualcoatl made a triumphant return to Texcoco to rule as its king. With Itzcoatl reigning in Tenochtitlan, they brought in the city of Tlacopan as a junior partner to cement a formal agreement. This treaty established their joint dominion over the Valley of Mexico. The three city-states carved up the old Teutonic territories and pledged to collaborate on future military campaigns, sharing the resulting tribute. The pact they formalized, which history remembers as the Triple Alliance, would serve as the very bedrock for a new regional superpower, the entity we now call the Aztec Empire. As the historian W. H. Prescott would observe in the 1840s, he saw a distinct duality within the Aztec character, which he believed stemmed from two entirely different origins. The Aztec's sophisticated side, with its strict etiquette, mathematical prowess, and appreciation for poetry, seemed to Prescott a clear inheritance from the legendary Toltec Empire. In stark contrast, he saw their nomadic past as the source for their more brutal tendencies, a thirst for conquest, the thrill of battle, and the grim reality of blood sacrifice. While this idea is far too simple and can't be proven, it does perfectly illustrate the puzzle that has faced historians studying the Aztecs for centuries. During this period, this very conflict of character was perfectly mirrored in the two allied kings, Itzcoatl and Nezahualcóyotl. Upon his return to power in Texcoco, Nezahualcóyotl established himself as a just and remarkably peaceful ruler. He commissioned a temple in his city where the practice of sacrifice, whether human or animal, was strictly forbidden. His true passion was literature. He founded a massive library, filling it with every manuscript he could find, including beautifully painted pictographic documents made from deerskin and bark paper. He was also a poet, with his own verses being passed down orally for generations before the Spanish recorded them in the 16th century. One of his most well-known songs reveals a belief that poetry was a balm for life's sorrows, reading, "Perhaps my friends will be lost, my companions will vanish when I lie down in that place. Flowers are our only garments, only songs make our pain subside." His co-ruler, Itzcoatl, couldn't have been more different. Itzcoatl was driven by a powerful ambition to forge the new Triple Alliance into an imperial force that would dwarf anything the Teutonics had ever built, and he was entirely willing to use ruthless tactics to achieve his goal. Aiding him in this endeavor was an enigmatic figure known to us only as Tlactli. This Tlactli was the brother of the gentle King Chimalpopoca, who had been murdered in his bed by Teutonic assassins, but he possessed none of his siblings' softness. He had served as Itzcoatl's advisor throughout the war, steadily climbing the court hierarchy to become his chief counsel. It was a role he would maintain through the next three kings' reigns, leading some historians to argue that Tlactli was the real power behind the Aztec Empire. Despite being offered the throne on several occasions, he consistently turned it down, choosing instead to operate from the shadows as the ultimate kingmaker. On one hand, Tlactli was a dedicated reformer. He was determined to turn the Aztec state into an efficient machine, with modernized administration and methods for collecting taxes. However, the kind of state Tlactli wanted to build also had remarkable and terrifying similarities to dictatorships from our more recent history. First and foremost, Tlactli understood the power of controlling information. As soon as Itzcoatl took the throne in Tenochtitlan, Tlactli advised him to inspect its library and destroy any historical texts they found inconvenient to their narrative. The Aztec chronicles remember this act, stating, "Once, they used to keep a record of their history, but it was burned at the time when Itzcoatl reigned in Mexico." The nobles agreed, explaining, "It is not fitting that all the people should know the paintings. The common serfs will be led astray because in the documents are many lies, and many heroes have been taken for gods." This contrast highlights the profound split in the Aztec soul. While King Nezahualcóyotl was on one side of the lake writing poetry and building a library, Itzcoatl was on the other, burning books. Where Nezahualcóyotl had banned human sacrifice, Itzcoatl would massively increase the practice, with his advisor Tlactli seemingly the driving force. Tlactli clearly grasped the power of violent public spectacle as a tool for controlling the masses. He wanted the people of the valley to truly fear the power of their state, and they did. Alongside an increase in public brutality, Tlactli also reformed the valley's religion. The Mexica war god Huitzilopochtli, previously one god among several like Tlaloc and Quetzalcoatl, was now raised to rule over all the others. This move elevated the Mexica to the status of God's chosen people and made the power of the military paramount in Aztec society. Tlaloc claimed that only warriors who died in battle would go to serve Huitzilopochtli in the afterlife. This began a new age of militarism in which warriors who died in battle were honored as the supreme heroes. A hymn, meant to be sung by all the people of Tenochtitlan, embodies the new warlike spirit of this age. The bonfire smokes, shields thunder, god of the ringing bells, the flower of the enemy shudders, eagles and tigers resound, the dust grows yellow. Red blossoms shall bud, unfold, and open into flower. O God eagle, in your house you rule, your banner trembles and flames and the bonfire crackles. Partly due to this new militaristic attitude, the Aztec Empire expanded with unstoppable speed. King Itzcoatl gathered a great army and marched on his neighboring cities, conquering them one by one. Diego Duran writes that Tlaloc gave a proclamation to the lords of the gathered cities, "We are capable of conquering the entire world." For a time, that's what it must have looked like. Soon, all the other cities around Lake Texcoco were subdued. Other states, alarmed by the rapid expansion of the Aztecs, gave in to all their demands without a fight and paid regular tribute. Soon, the Aztecs began to send their armies out beyond the valley, marching through the mountain passes cut between the volcanoes. When King Itzcoatl died in 1440, his successor, Moctezuma I, came to power. He reformed the Aztec Empire and massively expanded it, turning Tenochtitlan into the dominant party in the former Triple Alliance. The war over the Aztec character was being won by the warlike, domineering side of Tenochtitlan. After Moctezuma I, the kings Axyacatl and Tizoc both expanded the empire even further, and all these kings had the same shadowy figure, Tlaloc, advising them. Aztec armies marched into the lands to the north, bringing the desert peoples under their rule. They marched south, making inroads into the land of the Maya and on to the Pacific coast, and they went east and conquered lands on the Atlantic coast, too. Tenochtitlan was never an empire in the way we might imagine it. It usually didn't occupy the lands it conquered, rarely setting up garrisons or installing administrators, except in the most rebellious provinces. It was more like a network of tribute which saw wealth flow in one direction, to the city of Tenochtitlan. The historian Inga Clendenin describes it in the following manner. Tenochtitlan was a beautiful parasite, feeding on the lives and labor of other peoples and casting its shadow over all of their arrangements. The administration of this empire was conducted along a remarkable communications network made up of well-maintained roads. Because there were no horses in the Americas, messages were carried by runners stationed every 4 kilometers or so along the roads, where each messenger's task was to sprint their 4-kilometer leg and then relay the message to the next person in the chain. Using this highly efficient system, news could traverse the entire length of the empire in only a handful of days. This organizational prowess, however, did not translate into a gentle reign. Throughout the villages they subjugated, Aztec soldiers and tax collectors were universally despised. They would arrive to take tribute in the form of food and goods, seize people for sacrifice, and suppress any sign of resistance with overwhelming brutality. Yet one group experienced a level of Aztec cruelty that was truly unmatched. Living just east of the Valley of Mexico over the mountains were a Nahuatl-speaking people known as the Tlaxcalans. If you were to ask the Tlaxcalans, they would recount a history of the Aztecs repeatedly attempting and failing to conquer them. The Aztecs, however, told a different story, claiming they could have easily crushed their rivals at any moment but had simply chosen not to. Whatever the truth, the result was a very peculiar dynamic. The Tlaxcalans successfully maintained their independence, yet they were locked in a constant state of war with the surrounding Aztec Empire, which enforced a complete blockade, preventing luxury goods like salt or fine textiles from ever reaching their lands. The Tlaxcalans were also compelled to take part in an annual ritual conflict known as the Flower Wars. The name Flower War is a curious pairing of words, which points to a fascinating feature of the Nahuatl language, its fondness for creating meaning through such pairs. We do this in English as well, with phrases like our bread and butter, heart and soul, or sticks and stones. These are combinations where two words together signify a completely different concept, a major characteristic of Nahuatl. For example, when the Mexica wanted to say someone gave a speech, they would say he gave his word and breath. A person's village was described as their water and hill. To die was to pass into cold and silence, and to do something in secret was to do it in clouds and mist. To the Aztecs, the word flower also meant poetic and beautiful. This idea permeated their culture, especially their view of combat. An Aztec warrior who fell in battle was said to have died a flowery death, an end that was considered both noble and poetic. The belief was that such a warrior would be resurrected among what they called flower and bird, meaning they would be reborn into the natural world. This worldview is captured perfectly in a piece of their oral poetry, which reads, "Bells clamor, the chief is resplendent, he who makes the world live is full of delight. The flowers of the shield are opening their petals, glory spreads, it revolves around the earth. Here is the intoxication of death in the midst of the plain. There, as war breaks out on the plain, the chieftain shines, spins, gyrates with flowery death in war. Fear not, my heart. On the plain I covet death by the obsidian knife. All that our hearts desire is death." The so-called flower wars were intensely theatrical spectacles, resembling something akin to a Mardi Gras parade. Mexica war parties would arrive in their most extravagant and vivid attire. Jaguar warriors wore their namesake mottled pelts, while eagle warriors donned brilliant feathers. They all brandished brightly colored shields, which were adorned with more feathers and embroidered with heraldic designs. The whole scene was a flurry of flapping orange cloaks, red hats, and warriors wearing masks, tassels, and jangling bells. However, all this vibrant pageantry was deeply deceiving, as the stakes in the flower wars remained incredibly high. Combatants wielded spears, obsidian daggers, and a formidable sword-like weapon called the macuahuitl. This weapon looked similar to a cricket bat, but its edges were lined with razor-sharp shards of obsidian glass. True to most Aztec warfare, the objective was not to kill opponents on the field, but to capture them alive for future sacrifice. After a flower war concluded, the skulls of the sacrificed captives were put on grisly display. They were arranged on enormous racks in Tenochtitlan, several of which have been unearthed by modern archaeologists. The largest such rack ever discovered was located at the main temple and held the remains of over 650 individuals. For the Tlaxcalans, this meant leading a miserable existence. They were deliberately kept impoverished and starved, and then forced to watch as their citizens were taken for this ritualized slaughter. It should come as no surprise that this bred a profound and bitter hatred for the Aztecs within them. Ultimately, it was this deep-seated resentment that sowed the seeds for the empire's eventual collapse. The Aztecs had originally climbed to power by exploiting the widespread hatred for the old Tepic Empire. The Tepics' cruel rule ensured that when war came, no one was willing to fight for them, and their supposed allies were easily persuaded to betray them. History would soon prove that this was a lesson the Aztecs should have taken to heart. In the year 1487, the shadowy advisor Tlaxcala passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 90, undoubtedly a happy man. By then, the island city of Tenochtitlan was the vibrant heart of a massive empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This empire ruled over the lives of up to 6 million people and was on a trajectory to become the greatest the continent had ever known. Yet, in just over 30 years, this entire society would be brought to ruin. Their downfall would come because they were about to meet another power, one that would surpass them in military force, in ruthlessness, and at times in sheer cruelty. Roughly 30 years after Tlaxcala's death, the Florentine Codex records that a mysterious light once again appeared in the skies over Mexico. It was a comet of dazzling brilliance that grew brighter with each passing day. The account states, 10 years before the arrival of the Spaniards, an omen first appeared in the sky like a flame or tongue of fire, like the light of dawn. It appeared to be throwing off sparks and seemed to pierce the sky. It was wide at the bottom and narrow at the top. It looked as though it reached the very middle of the sky, its very heart and center. It showed itself off to the east. When it came out at midnight, it appeared like the dawn. No one could have known it then, but this celestial light was a harbinger of the Aztec age's end. As previously mentioned, a land bridge from Asia had once existed during the low sea levels of the last ice age, allowing Stone Age humans to cross into the Americas. Beginning around 16,000 years ago, however, rising sea levels swallowed that bridge beneath the waves. This event split humanity into two massive, isolated populations, each confined to one of the planet's two great landmasses. Without either group realizing it, the separation of the continents had fired the starting pistol on a long race for survival. These two populations would inevitably meet again in the distant future. The separate developments each society made during those intervening 16,000 years of isolation would ultimately decide which one would survive the encounter. For a variety of reasons, the people who settled the continents of the Americas were at an inherent disadvantage. This is a hotly contested and understandably emotional subject, with many factors at play. But perhaps the most significant point is that humans simply arrived in the Americas much later than they did elsewhere. Our species evolved in Africa between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. The Great Migration out of Africa began in the last 60,000 years. Humans reached southern Asia by 50,000 years ago, China by 40,000 years ago, and most of Europe by 30,000 years ago. This timeline reveals that virtually the entire Afro-Eurasian landmass had been settled for tens of thousands of years before anyone ever stepped foot in the Americas. During that vast expanse of time, the populations of the Old World were growing and undertaking the incredibly slow transition from hunter-gatherers to part-time farmers, and eventually to full-time agriculturalists. Their settlements expanded, forming the early cradles of civilization. Indeed, civilizations such as those in the Indus Valley, Egypt, and Mesopotamia only emerged into the historical record about 7,000 years ago. The development of a so-called cradle of civilization is a profoundly slow process, primarily because nearly every food we enjoy today is a human invention. Nature, far from being a bounteous garden, initially offered very little for early humans to eat, and what was available would have been quite unpleasant. Everything from wheat and barley to bananas, peas, and oranges originated from an ancestor that was far less palatable, offered minimal nutrition, and was significantly harder for our bodies to process. The banana serves as an excellent case study. Its journey began in Southeast Asia as a wild species with a bluish-green rind and packed with large, tough seeds, making it almost impossible for humans to eat. Over countless generations, however, desperate hunter-gatherers would have selected the most edible specimens to bring back to their camps. Seeds from these slightly better fruits would have sprouted near their settlements. In time, these early people started to cultivate the plants more deliberately, choosing only the plumpest fruits from each harvest to plant for the next one. The plant began to transform at an imperceptibly slow pace, so slow that no individual would have seen a difference in their lifetime. Gradually, its seeds shrank, its flesh grew sweeter and softer, and its peel acquired the familiar bright yellow color. We are indebted to the tireless efforts of thousands of anonymous generations who domesticated these essential plants. It required many millennia for the inhabitants of Mesopotamia to transform wild mountain grasses into the nourishing wheat and barley central to modern diets, a process that started as early as 10,000 BC. These foundational cereals eventually spread throughout the rest of Afro-Eurasia. Peas and lentils were also among the very first crops to be domesticated. Evidence from the Shanidar cave in Kurdistan suggests even Neanderthals consumed wild peas 46,000 years ago. But the modern pea was first cultivated in Iraq around 11,000 years ago. This agricultural revolution was transformative, fueling the expansion of early societies. As the crops improved, they provided more calories and protein, which in turn made it possible to sustain much larger populations. The peoples of the Americas, however, were relative newcomers to their continent. The first inhabitants of the Valley of Mexico are thought to have arrived around 12,000 BC, at the very time when wheat and peas were just beginning to be cultivated in the Near East. These early arrivals in Mexico discovered vast herds of mammoths and other large game to hunt. This abundance meant that several thousand years would pass before they faced the necessary pressure to shift from their hunter-gatherer existence. Consequently, one of the staple foods of the Americas, maize or corn, only began its domestication process about 7,000 years ago. By this stage, the Ubaid culture in Mesopotamia was already a sophisticated and flourishing agricultural society. This timeline gave the Old World a significant head start of roughly 3 to 4,000 years in the laborious work of crop domestication. Some historians also point to the inherent nature of the plants themselves as another factor. Here again, the peoples of the Americas faced a degree of misfortune. Corn, a cornerstone of the Mexican diet, is believed to have descended from a plant called teosinte, an exceptionally bitter grass that bears no resemblance to the plump, sweet cobs we know today. Breeding this unappetizing plant into modern corn required such a radical transformation that it may have taken American farmers longer than it took Mesopotamians to turn wild grasses into wheat, a far less dramatic genetic leap. Other disparities existed as well. The lower diversity of fauna in the Americas created a further disadvantage. In the Aztec world, only two animals were suitable for domestication: turkeys and dogs. In the Old World, however, livestock such as sheep, goats, and pigs provided a substantial and reliable source of protein. Cows were not only a source of meat and milk, but also served as essential pack animals, carrying heavy loads and pulling plows. Most critical of all was the horse. Although horses originally evolved in the Americas, they had vanished from the continent during the last ice age. It's often claimed that empires like the Aztecs never invented the wheel, but this isn't quite accurate. Archaeologists have discovered numerous clay toys for Mexica children that feature perfectly functional wheels. Even with their knowledge of the wheel, had the Mexica tried to create large-scale vehicles, the idea would likely have been discarded. Without any draft animals like horses or oxen to provide pulling power, a wheeled cart offered very little in the way of labor-saving benefits. Instead, people transported goods using straps secured around their foreheads. While this method was perfectly functional, it demanded that a huge segment of the population be dedicated entirely to manual transport, representing yet another key disadvantage when compared to the animal-powered societies of the Old World. The combined landmass of Afro-Eurasia is roughly double the size of the Americas. This immense habitable space, settled by humans for tens of thousands of additional years, naturally supported a vastly larger population. While scholarly estimates for the pre-contact population of the Americas fluctuate dramatically from as low as 8 million to as high as over 100 million, a figure around 60 million is often considered plausible. The contrast with the Old World, however, is staggering. By 1200 AD, a full century before the Mexica had even settled in the Valley of Mexico, China's population alone had soared past 140 million. A greater number of people simply meant more minds were available to solve problems and create new inventions. Moreover, sprawling trade networks like the Silk Road ensured that an innovation in China or India could reach Europe within years. The combination of these advantages, including a 3,000 to 4,000 year head start in agriculture, led to profoundly different developmental timelines for the two hemispheres. As one example, pottery appeared in Mesopotamia over 7,000 years ago, but it would be another 2.5 millennia before it emerged in Mexico. Likewise, bronze making began in India and the Near East around 3,300 BC, spreading to Europe and East Asia over the next few centuries. Back in Mexico, experimentation with bronze was only just beginning during Tenochtitlan's 14th century Golden Age. Meanwhile, high-carbon steel, a technology developed in South India way back in the 6th century BC, had long been traded across the Old World, but it would never appear independently in the Americas. To put this gap into perspective, when Mexico's first great empire, Teotihuacan, was peaking in the 5th century AD, the Old World's historical ledger was already filled with the complete stories of empires like Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. At the moment of Teotihuacan's collapse around the year 550, Chinese innovators were creating the first matches, while Indian engineers were developing the spinning wheel. Fast forward to the fall of the Toltec Empire in the early 12th century. By then, The Chinese had not only invented gunpowder, but also the seafaring magnetic compass. When the Mexica themselves finally entered the Valley of Mexico around 1300, Italian artisans were crafting the first eyeglasses, and Arab and European scientists had figured out the principles of light refraction. The technological gap only widened. Around the birth of the great Aztec emperors Toxcatl and Nezahualcóyotl, China was producing the first handheld cannons, and Korea was deploying the first naval artillery. During the very years that Toxcatl was burning historical codices in Tenochtitlan and Nezahualcóyotl was assembling his grand library in Texcoco, the printing press was being invented over in Germany. Then, in the mid-1400s, Spain developed the arquebus, a precursor to the musket. This isn't to say the Aztecs and other American peoples weren't brilliant, they absolutely were. But closing a technological gap of 3,000 or 4,000 years was an impossible task. The deck was stacked against them long before this world-changing conflict even began. Out of all these disparities, one innovation would stand out as the ultimate game-changer: the ocean-going ship. A revolution in naval engineering during the 14th and 15th centuries produced a groundbreaking vessel called the caravel. Before its invention, European sailors were largely confined to navigating along coastlines. However, Portuguese shipbuilders pioneered the creation of bigger and more capable vessels, and the caravel was what allowed them to begin exploring the African coast. By the close of the 1400s, an even more impressive upgrade emerged in the form of the carrack. These were massive, sturdy ships, often boasting as many as 6 sails and perfectly designed for long-distance travel across open seas. Weighing over 1,000 tons, a carrack could hold vast quantities of provisions, making voyages lasting many months feasible. This new ship design was the key that unlocked regular maritime trade between Europe and India, sailing all the way around the continent. The legendary Silk Road, with its grand trading hubs of Samarkand, Baghdad, and Tashkent, was seeing its influence wane. Global commerce was shifting, flowing instead along new maritime highways that funneled riches directly into European ports. As coffers in these cities overflowed, the nations perched on the Atlantic's edge grew bolder, dreaming of expeditions that pushed the boundaries of the known world. One such voyage launched in 1492, a mere half-decade after the passing of the Aztec mastermind Tenochtitlan. It consisted of a large carrack, the Santa Maria, and 2 nimble caravels, captained by an explorer named Christopher Columbus, as they pushed westward into the unknown ocean. For the Aztec Empire, the existence of these 3 ships was as alien and unthinkable as the concept of an asteroid was to the great Quetzalcoatlus that once soared through the prehistoric sky. And just as a brilliant, fiery comet streaked across the Central American heavens, a terrifying, blood-red omen, an equally world-shattering force was charting a course straight for them, poised to strike without warning. Our story now focuses on 2 central figures, whose lives in the year 1502 could not be more different. We begin with a man who, by his own world's measure, was the planet's most powerful and affluent individual. This was Moctezuma II, the newly crowned king of the Aztecs. As the 9th ruler of Tenochtitlan, the 35-year-old ascended to the throne at a moment of supreme imperial confidence, and his people surely expected him to lead them to even greater heights. Moctezuma himself was a man of average build with the dark, wavy hair common among the Mexica, his face defined by a prominent forehead and an aquiline nose. Those who met him described a man who was courteous and diplomatic, possessing an eloquent voice that carried a subtle but undeniable authority. In fact, he often spoke in such a low register that his lips hardly seemed to move at all. His coronation in 1502 was a magnificent, multi-stage event. It began with several days of solitary prayer and fasting inside the temples. This spiritual retreat was followed by an explosion of public celebration, filled with vibrant music, dancing, feasts, and the grand arrival of nobles from every corner of the Aztec lands. To complete the ceremony, a new king was traditionally required to wage war. Moctezuma fulfilled this duty by quelling several imperial rebellions, returning to the capital with a great many prisoners destined for the sacrificial stone. For days, their blood would have cascaded down the great temple steps, a spectacle Moctezuma would have presided over while wearing a breathtaking headdress fashioned from the iridescent green feathers of the quetzal bird. Imagine the roar of the crowd as their new emperor, hands held high, accepted the devotion of a sprawling empire. To find our second protagonist, we must journey almost 9,000 kilometers east, across the vast Atlantic. Our destination is the small Spanish village of Medellin, set amidst limestone cliffs and forests of pine and cypress. The town rests on the Guadiana River, a landscape of olive groves and conifers watched over by a formidable 10th-century castle perched on a stone outcrop. Within one of the village's whitewashed, terracotta-roofed homes, a pale and sickly-looking 17-year-old is sitting by himself. This boy had always been frail. As a child, his health was so poor that his parents had resigned themselves to his death on more than one occasion. At 14, he was sent to live with his uncle in Salamanca to study Latin, a path his family hoped would lead to a respectable law career. The boy, however, despised his studies and returned home after just 2 years, much to his parents' dismay. So here he is in 1502, trapped in his provincial hometown at the exact same moment Emperor Moctezuma is being crowned in a blaze of glory on the far side of the world. The sheer boredom of his existence has soured his disposition. The 16th-century historian Francisco López de Gamarra noted that he was restless, haughty, and prone to mischief and arguments, making him a source of trouble to his parents as well as to himself. The name of this quarrelsome teenager was Hernando Cortés, though his friends called him Hernan. Looking at this discontented 17-year-old, you would never guess the incredible destiny that awaited him, though you might just have spotted a certain spark deep within his gaze. That spark was a reflection of his social standing. Cortés belonged to a class known as the Hidalgos, men of noble ancestry who owned no land. With very little to inherit, the son of a Hidalgo faced a less than enviable future. As he approached his 18th birthday, Cortés believed his path was set. He planned to travel to Italy, where a number of raging wars ensured constant demand for mercenaries. However, as that day drew closer, his attention was increasingly captured by news of discoveries from the other side of the world. When Cortés was just 7, Columbus had landed in the Caribbean. A decade later, with Cortés now 18, the explorer Amerigo Vespucci published a Latin work called Mundus Novus, or the New World. In it, he proposed the radical idea that the lands Columbus had found were not the edge of Asia, as everyone thought, but an entirely separate landmass. This concept, spread rapidly across Europe by the relatively new printing press, ignited a frenzy for exploration. In the years since, fantastic stories had begun to flow back to Europe about the opportunities across the sea, including tales of veritable mountains of gold. With each new account he heard, Cortés's enthusiasm for a military career in Italy faded. According to the historian de Gamarra, he soon made up his mind. After weighing his 2 options, he chose to sail for the Indies, deciding it was a more profitable journey than Naples on account of the vast quantity of gold said to be coming from there. Cortés lingered in the port town of Valencia for 2 years, where he developed a love for gambling that would never leave him. Despite this vice and others, he eventually gathered enough money to buy passage on a ship across the Atlantic. In the year 1504, at the age of 19, he finally set sail. Cortés kept no personal account of his roughly 2-month journey across the sea, but the journey to this new world was anything but glamorous. We get a sense of the ordeal from a Dominican friar who documented his experience, describing the ship as a strong and narrow prison from which no one can flee. The heat and stuffiness were overpowering, with the floor serving as the common bed. He wrote that the confinement and the terrible smell, especially below deck, left most passengers feeling sick or as if they were losing their minds. It's no wonder landing on the island of Hispaniola, today divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, must have felt like a profound relief. This was the very place where the European story in the Americas began, the island Columbus had first claimed. In a famous twist of irony, Christopher Columbus would die insisting he had reached the east coast of Asia, never admitting he'd found a new continent, the very achievement he's remembered for. This delusion, however, didn't stop him from creating a brutal system in Hispaniola, enslaving as many indigenous people as possible and working tens of thousands to death in his gold mines. The sheer scale of this slave labor was so appalling that even people back in Spain began calling Columbus Pharaoh. His regime ruled through terror and sadistic punishments, killing an estimated 200,000 native people, a level of cruelty that would make most Aztec kings seem benevolent by comparison. To save the faint of heart, the graphic details will be spared, but the rumors of his brutality eventually became too much for the Spanish king, who had him removed from power in 1500. Yet for Hispaniola's native people, the situation hardly improved. Their population was so devastated that by 1513, the first African slaves were being imported to replace them. Hispaniola had established the blueprint for European settlement, a steamroller that would crush all other forms of life beneath it, a pattern destined to be repeated countless times in the centuries to come. We have no record of what the 18-year-old Cortés thought as he stepped into this world. He quickly registered as a citizen, which entitled him to a plot of land for a house and farm, complete with a staff of enslaved locals. Thanks to his couple of years of legal training, he secured a position as a notary in a small town. For the next 6 years, he learned the practical ins and outs of the law right at the edge of the known world, officiating legal documents. But just as it had in his childhood, a familiar boredom began to set in. By 1511, he was ready to answer the siren call of a more exciting prospect. That prospect came in the form of Diego de Velázquez, a powerful figure in the New World, 20 years Cortés's senior. Velázquez was organizing an expedition to conquer the neighboring island of Cuba and repeat the profitable model established in Hispaniola. Cortés immediately signed on. He was among just 300 men who landed on Cuba and began a process of crushing native resistance through a campaign of indiscriminate violence and extreme cruelty. Cortés's role in this was not as a soldier. Instead, he was the clerk to the expedition's treasurer. His responsibility was to note down every profit acquired and to guarantee that the Spanish crown received its legally mandated 1/5 of everything gained. Once the invasion was complete, Velázquez, now governor, was so impressed with Cortés's legal and administrative skills that he made him his personal secretary. In the newly founded settlement of Santiago, Cortés was also appointed municipal magistrate. As a reward for his service, Velázquez gifted him a large estate that included gold mines and even more enslaved people to work for him. As Cortés's power and influence swelled, it's clear Governor Velázquez started to see the ambitious young man as a potential rival. This was the period when Cortés began to cultivate an image of power, growing his beard thick and dressing extravagantly in a plumed hat, a gold medallion, and a black velvet cloak. But for all the wealth he accumulated, he was never satisfied. Inevitably, that familiar boredom returned, and he began to look over the horizon, wondering what other opportunities might lie out there. His answer would arrive with a series of expeditions over the next few years. Those expeditions to the American mainland soon began in earnest. The first major foray occurred in 1517, when an expedition under the command of Francisco Hernández de Córdoba charted the coast of Mexico. His men were awestruck by the Mayan cities they encountered on the Yucatan Peninsula's northern shore, settlements that dwarfed anything they had seen in Hispaniola or Cuba. This initial sense of wonder, however, proved short-lived. The entire venture was ill-fated, constantly hampered by a lack of fresh water. The local Mayans, perhaps only briefly intimidated by Spanish guns and steel armor, quickly assessed that the small party was vulnerable. They attacked, killing 50 Spaniards and mortally wounding Córdoba himself. At this stage, the Spanish had no clear idea what this landmass was. Most assumed it was just another large island, while some argued it had to be the coast of Asia. All they knew for sure was that a long coastline stretched out before them, with an unknown world lying behind it. Following the unlucky Córdoba expedition, another was launched a year later in 1518, led by Juan de Grijalva. This time, the Spanish took far greater precautions. Their ships came armed with small cannons known as culverins, which were capable of firing a 10-kilogram cannonball approximately 400 meters. Hernán Cortés, meanwhile, seems to have been occupied with his own work in Cuba and paid these early ventures little attention. That changed when Juan de Grijalva failed to return from his voyage, sparking rumors and anxiety throughout the colony. In response, the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, organized a search and rescue party to find Grijalva and learn what had happened. For reasons that remain unclear, Cortés was selected to lead this new expedition. He was not an obvious choice. At only 33 years old, he was relatively young and had never commanded an army or held any kind of military post. It's even possible Velázquez hoped Cortés would be killed on the mission, viewing it as a convenient way to eliminate an ambitious rival. But despite his military inexperience, Cortés was a skilled diplomat with a clear talent for persuasion. In just 1 month, he had convinced 300 men to join him and had 6 ships ready for the rescue mission. There was just one problem. Before the fleet could depart, Juan de Grijalva, the man they were setting out to find, sailed back into port. He had simply been delayed while exploring the Mexican coast, and he brought back incredible stories. He described seeing cities with tall pyramids and streets paved with stone, and he told of meeting a delegation from a powerful king named Moctezuma who ruled the land. While these stories were enticing, Grijalva's safe return took the wind out of Cortés's sails. He now had a fully funded search party for someone who was no longer missing. For Governor Velázquez, this was reason enough to cancel the voyage. If Grijalva had returned safely, perhaps the land wasn't so dangerous after all, and the last thing he wanted was for Cortés to gain the glory that would come from making new discoveries. But the restless, mischievous boy within Cortés had never truly disappeared. His old love of gambling may have also played a role in his next move. He decided to go ahead with the mission anyway, choosing to sail to this new land against the governor's wishes to discover the truth about the king across the water. Cortés gave the order to depart as soon as possible before Velázquez could stop him. Because the governor had been supplying all the food for the journey, this meant they would have to leave with no supplies. Undeterred, they set sail from Santiago on November 18, 1518. According to some sources, the governor heard of the plan at the last moment and hurried to the docks, only to find the 6 ships already pulling away from port. He is said to have called out, "Why, compadre, is this the way you leave? Is this a fine way to say farewell to me?" From the deck of his ship, Cortés allegedly called back his famous reply, "Forgive me, your worship, for this and similar things have to be done rather than thought about." Velázquez watched them go, knowing they wouldn't get far. They were drastically short on food. For weeks, Cortés's fleet sailed around the coast of Cuba, but everywhere they went, they discovered Governor Velázquez had sent orders ahead, telling the people not to give any supplies to the rogue expedition. Yet enough colonists were still willing to barter. They began buying up loaves of bread. Their growing stockpile soon included cassava bread, vats of pickled beef and pork, barrels of saltfish and biscuits, and even a number of live chickens. A stroke of luck brought them 200 veterans from Juan Grijalva's earlier voyage, who, along with other volunteers, eagerly signed on. This recruitment boom expanded their total force to approximately 630 men spread across a fleet of 11 ships. The cargo included 13 valuable horses, carefully lifted onto the decks by a pulley for the journey. For firepower, they carried several cannons, the very same light culverins from Grijalva's mission, alongside 30 crossbowmen and 12 men armed with the harquebus, a primitive musket. Accompanying them were large, formidable Mastiff dogs, a breed battle-hardened over centuries of European warfare. Following weeks of hopping between ports to gather these resources, the expedition was finally ready to cross the brilliant Blue Sea. The invasion of Mexico was officially underway. To understand the events that followed, we rely heavily on a key set of documents known as the Cartas of Cortés. These were a series of detailed letters penned by the Conquistador himself during the campaign and dispatched to King Charles V of Spain. The official title was quite a mouthful, starting with, "Sent to His Sacred Majesty, the Emperor, our sovereign by Don Fernando Cortés, Captain General of New Spain," in which he gives an account of the lands and provinces without number that he has newly discovered in Yucatan. These letters stand out for several reasons. Primarily, they represent the only known eyewitness account written during the invasion by a central participant. They are also incredibly ambitious from a literary standpoint, packed with vivid descriptions and color. However, As crucial as they are, using them as a historical source is fraught with challenges. Lacking a classical education, Cortés was unfamiliar with the great epics of Greece and Rome. Instead, his literary tastes ran to the popular chivalric romances of Spain, stories of heroic knights on grand adventures against foreign foes. This romantic sensibility heavily colors his writing. He consistently frames himself as the hero of his own story. Furthermore, his professional background as a notary and clerk gave him a deep understanding of Spanish law. Consequently, his reports are carefully constructed to present all of his actions as perfectly legal, painstakingly justifying every decision. For these reasons, historians must approach his letters with extreme caution, recognizing that his version of events is often loosely tethered to the actual truth. Thankfully, his account isn't the only one we have from the Spanish side. There are also the memoirs of two of the soldiers who followed Cortés on his expedition, writing down their memories as old men in the 1560s. One of these soldiers, Francisco de Aguilar, later renounced worldly possessions to join a Dominican monastery. The other, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, established himself as a landholder in Guatemala. Both men produced accounts that are highly flattering to the expedition's heroics, but their recollections are also muddled by the more than 40 years that had elapsed since the events occurred. From the Mexica perspective, no indigenous accounts were produced during the years of the invasion itself. The earliest were written a full 2 decades later. However, the Florentine Codex, which was assembled by the Spanish priest Sahagun, contains a truly remarkable narrative of this period. Known as Book 12, it is a compilation of memories from the Mexica people who survived the conquest. Much like the accounts of Bernal Diaz and de Aguilar, these recollections are viewed through the haze of several decades. This distance in time makes many specifics questionable, and it's highly unlikely that the exact wording of speeches by Moctezuma and Cortés is entirely accurate. Despite this, Book 12 of the Florentine Codex stands as an incredible source, revealing how the Mexica people remembered the cataclysmic experience that led to the fall of their civilization. The expedition of Juan de Grijalva, which had occurred the previous year, had already created a significant buzz within the court of the Aztec king, Moctezuma. His coastal lookouts had spotted the tall Spanish ships far out at sea. These Mexica observers would have witnessed the towering white sails marked with Spanish crosses, an image confirming they were seeing something entirely new to their world. While the Mexica are often depicted as reacting with fear or bewilderment at the sight of Europeans, we should approach these descriptions with caution. Europeans took great pleasure in telling tales about how the terrified Aztecs thought their ships were floating mountains or even cities moving across the water. The stories that Europeans particularly enjoyed were those claiming the Aztecs believed them to be gods. Writing 4 decades after the fact, the soldier Bernal Diaz embellished his own narrative with the idea that the Aztecs saw Cortés as the prophesied return of the god Quetzalcoatl. With time, these tales grew more elaborate, even adding details like Quetzalcoatl supposedly having pale skin. In truth, there is no solid evidence the Mexica ever believed the Europeans were divine beings, and these stories are almost certainly later inventions. If the Mexica did entertain such a notion, they abandoned it very quickly. They were undoubtedly stunned by their first glimpse of Spanish ships, not to mention their metal armor, firearms, and horses. But they swiftly made a practical assessment of the situation. These were simply men from another land, whose ships were bigger and whose weapons were deadlier than their own. As their interactions continued, it becomes clear they saw the Europeans not as gods, but as something more akin to devils. Upon seeing those tall white sails on the horizon, the Mexica watchmen didn't hesitate, immediately paddling their canoes out to investigate. As they neared the Spanish vessels, they performed a traditional sign of respect, mimicking a kiss to the earth. The Florentine Codex records the ensuing exchange from the Spanish ships. Then they embarked, launched off, and went out on the water. When they approached the Spaniards, they made the earth-eating gesture at the prow of the boat. The Spaniards called to them, "Who are you? Where have you come from? Where is your homeland?" The watchmen promptly responded, "It is from Mexico that we have come." The Spaniards pressed them, "If you are really Mexica, what is the name of the ruler of Mexico?" "Oh, our lords," they replied, "Moctezuma is his name. The Mexica had brought with them a selection of fine textiles as gifts, which they presented to the sailors. The Spanish offered some beaded jewelry in return, a gesture the Mexica accepted politely, though they would have found the items unimpressive. With a promise that they would be back soon, the Spanish departed. This small party of Mexica watchmen, undoubtedly shaken by the encounter, paddled back to shore. They resolved to travel to the capital, Tenochtitlan, and deliver a full report of what they had seen. Upon their arrival, they were summoned directly into the presence of the king. King Moctezuma would have been an imposing figure even to the Aztec nobility. To these commoners, he must have been absolutely terrifying. Many years later, in the 1560s, a Spanish friar named Diego Duran interviewed an elderly Mexica man who had spent most of his life as a palace worker. When Duran asked what Emperor Moctezuma looked like, the old man admitted he had no idea. In all his years of service, he had never once dared to raise his eyes and look. These humble watchmen would have entered the emperor's presence barefoot, keeping their heads bowed as they spoke. Making eye contact was strictly forbidden. They presented the king with the beads the Spanish had given them and then recounted their experience as clearly as they could. "O our lord, O master, destroy us if you will," they began, "but here is what we have seen and done, for we went to see our lords out on the water. We gave them all your cloaks, and here are the fine things belonging to them that they gave us." They relayed what the strangers had told them. "If you have really come from Mexico, here is what you are to give to the ruler Moctezuma, whereby he will recognize us." They recounted everything the Spaniards had said. Moctezuma was deeply disturbed by this news. For several years, unsettling rumors had been trickling across the region, whispers of terrible events that had befallen the people of Hispaniola and Cuba, islands that sat at the very edge of the Aztec world. In 1519, a canoe carrying native Jamaicans had even landed in his territory, seemingly refugees fleeing some great catastrophe. A strange chest had also washed ashore on the Gulf of Mexico and was brought all the way to Tenochtitlan for inspection. Inside were several suits of bizarre clothing, unlike anything the Mexica had ever seen. Accompanying the clothing were various jewels and a sword fashioned from a tough, gray metal. This collection of strange items deeply unsettled Moctezuma. As a ruler known for his caution and pragmatism, his immediate impulse was to gather more intelligence before making any moves. He commanded the men to maintain absolute secrecy about what they had witnessed. Then, he dispatched them back to the coast with orders to set up a continuous watch, just in case the enigmatic ships made another appearance. Moctezuma's instructions to the man from Cuetlaxtlan were precise. Establish lookouts all along the shoreline, specifically at places named Notlan, Tazatlan, and Mictlancuatla, covering any potential landing sites. His stewards departed to enact the command, ensuring a vigilant watch was kept. Following this, Moctezuma gathered his most trusted lords and presented them with the beads he'd been given. You can picture them huddling together, concerned whispers filling the room as they all tried to comprehend the meaning of these objects. For a time, an uneventful quiet settled over the capital. The days slipped by, leading into the festivities and rituals of the Aztec New Year. As the year progressed, Moctezuma may have even started to put the bizarre coastal encounter out of his mind. One of his favorite palace women gave birth to a new son. He delighted in watching his beloved performers, from skilled jugglers to dancing dwarves. He welcomed poets from the city of Texcoco, who recited works on classic Aztec themes, the fleeting nature of life, the glorious deaths of warriors, and the inevitable decay of empires. Life carried on in Tenochtitlan. But that peace was shattered as the year neared its end, when a fresh report reached the palace. More of the massive ships had been spotted on the horizon, this time in greater numbers. He acted at once, commanding a delegation to meet these newcomers and ascertain their purpose. After issuing the order, King Moctezuma likely sank onto the ornate mat that was his throne, his mind swirling with anxious thoughts. Meanwhile, Hernán Cortés and his fleet of 11 ships had completed the brief journey from Cuba to Mexico, beginning a weeks-long voyage along the coastline. The vessels cut through sapphire-blue seas, navigating past lush sandbars and pristine white beaches. Unbeknownst to him, during the first weeks of 1519, his fleet was tracing a path directly above the submerged remnants of the Chicxulub crater. the very site of an asteroid impact from 66 million years ago. Cruising at a steady 4 knots, or about 7 kilometers an hour, the fleet would have spent almost a full day crossing the massive, invisible ring of the crater buried beneath the waves. These weeks of coastal sailing passed uneventfully. Then, one afternoon, a lookout's shout broke the calm. A canoe was paddling directly for them. Its sole occupant was a man who appeared to be a local Mayan peasant. Imagine their collective shock, however, when he drew near and called out to them in perfect Spanish, his voice thick with emotion. The man who spoke was Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spaniard who immediately asked if they were Christians and which king they served. His own story was a harrowing one. He had been shipwrecked 8 years before while attempting to reach Cuba. The local Maya captured him and the 12 other survivors, with the intention of sacrificing every last one of them. Aguilar recounted how he and another man, Guerrero, had managed to break free. Their freedom was short-lived, however, as they were soon enslaved by a different Mayan king. For his companion Guerrero, this new life became a preference over his old one in Spain. He fully assimilated into Mayan culture, marrying a woman of high status, fathering children, and earning the king's trust as a war chief, even adorning his body with the tattoos of a Mayan warrior. But Aguilar's experience was the complete opposite. He despised his enslavement and yearned for Spain. To preserve his mind, he meticulously counted the passing of almost 3,000 days, constantly trying to remember the day of the week. He never stopped looking for an opportunity to flee. Upon hearing that Spanish ships were spotted off the coast, he seized his chance and raced to the shore. One of his first questions upon meeting his countrymen was about the current date. He was astonished to learn that after 8 years, his mental calendar was off by a mere 3 days. He believed it was Wednesday, but it was actually Sunday. During his long captivity, Aguilar had become proficient in the local Mayan language. Cortés recognized his immense value as a translator on the spot. He brought Aguilar into his expedition, giving his word that he would be returned to Cuba once their mission was complete. Not long after, the expedition's need for fresh water compelled them to stop at Patanchen, a sizable Mayan town located at the mouth of a river now known as the Rio Grijalva. The town's inhabitants, likely unsettled by rumors of these strange men in their massive ships, decided to meet the Spanish with force. This led to Cortés's first battle in Mexico, a short but vicious conflict. The Spanish force, comprised mostly of men who were not professional soldiers and lacked extensive training, faced its first real test. Yet they proved disciplined enough to follow orders and remain steady during the encounter. It was here that Cortés first deployed his cannons and guns, which produced their intended terrifying effect. The Mayan warriors quickly broke into a panic and fled, leaving 400 of their own dead. Their chief had no choice but to surrender. As a tribute, he presented the Spanish with a large quantity of gold. He also offered a gift of 20 enslaved women, who would accompany the expedition for much of its subsequent journey. By an incredible twist of fate, one of these women was someone Geronimo de Aguilar had known during his own enslavement. Her name was Melanson, and she would become arguably one of the single most pivotal figures in the collapse of the Aztec civilization. Melanson remains one of history's great enigmas. Born around the year 1500 in the contested lands between the Aztec Empire and the Mayan territories, her life took a tragic turn when her father died. After her mother remarried, Melanson was deemed a surplus child and sold to Mayan slavers. Some accounts even claim her family staged her death to avoid the social shame of selling their own daughter. Life as an enslaved woman was brutal. As wars raged between the Maya and the Mexica, Melanson was repeatedly traded as human spoils, passing from one master to another over many years. This constant upheaval, however, made her fluent in the languages of the region, including both Mayan and the Aztec language of Nahuatl. By the time the chief of Patanchen gifted her to Cortés, she was a living repository of Central American languages. Cortés instantly grasped her strategic importance. With her arrival, he possessed an perfect communication chain. Melanson could translate from Nahuatl to Mayan, and Aguilar could translate from Mayan to Spanish. This three-person team could relay messages and bridge the linguistic gap with nearly any group they encountered. Melanson is a deeply complex historical figure. We will never know her true motivations or how much of her assistance to the Spanish was by choice. Yet Cortés himself would later admit that without her, his entire endeavor might have failed. She appeared to aid his cause with a fervor that suggested more than the mere compliance of a slave. Perhaps her reasoning is not so difficult to understand. Her life to that point had been a relentless series of humiliations. Suddenly, at Cortés's side, she held a measure of power and was shown respect. It was a chance not just to reverse her own fortune, but to help bring down the very world that had so thoroughly broken her. With a direct line of communication now established, the complex political theater of the Aztec world was suddenly accessible to Cortés. He now had the power to make his demands known to the Mexica, and more critically, he had the power to deceive them. The true work of dismantling the empire was finally set to begin. Pushing north along the Mexican coastline, Cortés selected a suitable spot to make landfall. His first actions were swift and predatory, raiding several nearby native villages to seize food, supplies, and whatever gold he could find. This aggressive start underscored a critical reality for Cortés. His entire venture was teetering on the edge of illegality. Having brazenly defied the orders of Cuban Governor Velázquez to launch this expedition, he was acutely aware that not all his men were loyal. The specter of mutiny, fueled by allegiance to Velázquez, loomed as one of his most immediate threats. To counter this danger, he made a famously audacious move. 10 of his ships were deliberately scuttled, a decisive action that eliminated any chance for deserters to sail back to Cuba and report his insubordination. He did, however, spare a single vessel. This lone ship was dispatched on a transatlantic journey to Spain, its cargo a letter for King Charles V and a treasure chest filled with the first gold artifacts he'd acquired. Cortés's strategy was to circumvent the governor entirely and secure royal sanction directly from the king, a move that required him to navigate a perilous legal path. For some much-needed legal cover, Cortés promptly established a settlement on the sandy shores, naming it Vera Cruz, the True Cross. Physically, it was hardly a town, just a collection of tents and makeshift structures. Legally, however, it was a masterstroke. Cortés equipped it with the formal requirements of a Spanish town, including a municipal council staffed by his own soldiers. This maneuver allowed him to declare himself governor of Vera Cruz. This new title gave him the authority to act in the king's name, effectively empowering him to make his own decisions. Just days later, this new town received its first official visitors. A delegation of Mexica men, adorned in magnificent feathered regalia and embroidered cloaks, presented themselves as envoys from Moctezuma. They came bearing gifts of food, incense, and shimmering gold. Unseen at first, another group of men were positioned among the trees above the beach. These were Moctezuma's most skilled court painters, dispatched to document every detail of the newcomers. Cortés greeted the delegation, listening intently as their message began its long journey through his translators. Every word spoken in Nahuatl was first translated into Mayan by Melanson for Aguilar, who then rendered it into Spanish. Conversations filtered through this complex chain must have unfolded at a glacial pace. It seems almost poetic that Cortés's first official statement was a masterclass in manipulation. He presented himself as an ambassador, a servant of a mighty king who held dominion over most of the world. Then, he delivered an even more audacious falsehood, claiming his men were afflicted with a peculiar heart ailment for which the only cure was gold. With a calculated air of concern, he inquired if Moctezuma might spare some to help his ailing soldiers. The lead ambassador, seemingly oblivious to the trap, confirmed that Moctezuma indeed possessed vast quantities of gold. With that simple admission, the destiny of the Aztec Empire was likely sealed. In that instant, Cortés resolved to march on Tenochtitlan and claim it all. Meanwhile, back in the Grand Palace, Moctezuma's rage thundered through the corridors. He had hauled his most senior magicians and soothsayers before him, unleashing his fury upon them for their spectacular failure to predict this arrival. Their mystical methods scrying in obsidian mirrors, consuming hallucinogenic mushrooms, casting sacred corn had yielded nothing. The priest Diego Duran would later record the tirade that witnesses recalled Moctezuma screaming, It is your position, then, to be deceivers, tricksters, to pretend to be men of science and forecast that which will take place in the future, deceiving everyone. But everything is a lie. It is all pretense. While some soothsayers faced punishment, Moctezuma's anger eventually gave way to deep contemplation. He must have spent hours scrutinizing the detailed paintings his artists delivered, images that were utterly alien, towering ships with sails like white clouds, men in peculiar garments, and most baffling of all, the powerful beasts they rode upon creatures that resembled a kind of hornless deer. What surely troubled him most, however, were the reports of a weapons demonstration. The tales his ambassadors recounted were beyond belief. The Florentine Codex captures the sheer terror these accounts inspired. When he heard what the messages reported, he was greatly afraid and taken aback. It especially made him faint when he heard how the guns went off at the Spaniards' command, sounding like thunder, causing people actually to swoon. When it went off, something like a ball came out from inside and fire went showering and spitting out, and the smoke that came from it had a very foul stench. If they shot at a hill, it seemed to crumble and come apart. It turned a tree to dust. It seemed to make it vanish as though someone had conjured it away. The report concluded that the strangers' battle gear was fashioned entirely from iron, encasing their bodies in metal. This iron protected them from head to toe. Their helmets, swords, bows, shields, and lances were all made of the strange metal, and they rode upon massive deer that stood as tall as the rooftops. History has often painted Moctezuma as a weak and indecisive ruler, a portrayal that doesn't quite hold up to scrutiny. In the days following the reports, he launched several practical initiatives to handle the situation. His first priority was intelligence. Messengers were dispatched far and wide, consulting the rulers and archives of every city on the continent for any record of these strange visitors who had so abruptly materialized. One by one, they returned with the same answer: no one knew a thing. Concurrently, Moctezuma established a surveillance network. He commanded spies to infiltrate every town and village between the coast and Tenochtitlan, with orders to report immediately if the Spaniards began to move inland. For good measure, he also tasked his disgraced magicians with redeeming themselves by attempting to place curses and spells upon the foreigners. Yet despite these efforts, the profound uncertainty of the situation clearly began to weigh heavily on the Aztec king. During this period, Moctezuma found no rest, unable to sleep or even eat. He was perpetually distracted and seemed deeply ill at ease, sighing frequently. A heavy fatigue settled upon him, and he lost all taste for the things he once found enjoyable or amusing. This stark contrast in knowledge reveals that the true Spanish advantage lay not merely in their technology, but in information. From Moctezuma's perspective, the Spanish were a complete enigma. They had no known city to conquer, no wives or children to take as hostages, and no discernible weaknesses. Their origins, their motives, and their ultimate goals were a total mystery, making it nearly impossible for him to formulate a coherent strategy to counter them. The Spanish situation could not have been more different. Within days of landing, Cortés was already dispatching letters back to Europe, calling for reinforcements and providing detailed accounts of the new lands. His reports were quickly printed and began circulating throughout European cities. He even shipped back artifacts he had plundered from Aztec temples, which were put on display in town halls across Europe less than a year later. In 1520, the renowned German painter Albrecht Dürer viewed some of this Aztec art and later wrote about its impact. "All the days of my life I have seen nothing that rejoiced my heart so much as these things, for I have seen among them wonderful works of art, and I marveled at the subtle intellects of men in foreign parts." Incredibly, within a short time, the Spanish had learned everything necessary to dismantle the empire. Cortés knew of a great king named Moctezuma who ruled from a city called Tenochtitlan. He knew this king was the most powerful in the land and that he commanded vast quantities of gold. Most importantly, he learned that Moctezuma had enemies. Possessing these three critical facts was all Cortés required to formulate a devastating strategy, one designed to deliver a series of hammer blows that would bring the entire structure of the Aztec Empire crashing down. The very first of these blows was about to land on a people we've encountered before, and that very people were the Tlaxcalans, a deep, An abiding hatred for the Aztecs had festered among the Tlaxcalan people for generations. They had endured years of Aztec blockades that starved their communities, been forced into ritual flower wars, and witnessed their sons sacrificed atop Mexica temples. Hernan Cortés understood that Moctezuma's army was immense, and that his own small force of 600 men stood no chance alone. He desperately needed to cultivate local alliances. The instant he learned of the Tlaxcalan's animosity toward the Mexica, he recognized the perfect opportunity. On August 8, 1519, Cortés began his march toward Tenochtitlan. Acknowledging the road to the coast as his vital lifeline for supplies and reinforcements, he made the tactical decision to leave nearly half his company behind to garrison the town of Vera Cruz. With a contingent of just 300 men, he set off. The Spaniards marched in their full armor and even slept in it, constantly on edge about the possibility of a surprise attack. Cortés himself, as he noted in a letter, barely rested, declaring, "I shall not sleep until I have seen Moctezuma and observed the quality of his land." The journey from the coast to the Valley of Mexico covered a distance of roughly 400 kilometers. Its initial leg took them through a flat, hot, tropical landscape, where dense forests were interspersed with Aztec maize plantations. From there, the terrain rose dramatically, and the towering forms of great volcanoes began to dominate the scenery on both sides. Along the way, local villages provided them with maize and gold, and even more enslaved people who were forced to haul their heavy guns. Cortés chillingly wrote, "I burnt more than 10 villages, in one of which there were more than 3,000 houses where the inhabitants fought with us. As we were carrying the cross and were fighting for our faith, God gave us such a victory that we killed many of them without ourselves receiving any hurt." Upon reaching the highlands, the expedition would have traversed a cold, desolate salt flat before the massive mountain range enclosing the Valley of Mexico appeared on the horizon. In this forbidding environment, water grew scarce, and their food supplies dwindled. At long last, they finally entered the territory of the Tlaxcalans. Cortés seemed to believe this part would be simple. He figured he could just announce his intention to overthrow Moctezuma, and the Tlaxcalans would immediately embrace him as a liberator. However, years of conflict with the Mexica had instilled a deep-seated paranoia in the Tlaxcalan people. When they spotted the small column of Spaniards marching toward them, they didn't see allies. They saw a potential raid by Moctezuma. The alarm was sounded, and every available warrior was summoned to march out in full force to defend their homeland. With faces painted black and white, the Tlaxcalan warriors let out war cries that must have echoed across the mountain slopes. They completely surrounded the Spanish and crashed against their lines in relentless waves. They came perilously close to overwhelming the invaders, but the obsidian blades of their macuahuitls shattered uselessly against European steel armor. In stark contrast, Spanish steel swords sliced effortlessly through the Tlaxcalan's padded protection, while crossbow bolts and gunfire tore through their tightly packed formations, spreading chaos. As the soldier Bernal Diaz later recalled, "I saw our company in such confusion that despite the shouts of Cortés and the other captains, they could not hold together. One thing alone saved our lives. The enemy were so massed and so numerous that every shot wrought havoc among them." The Spanish horsemen were also devastatingly effective, repeatedly charging and swinging into the Tlaxcalan ranks with their lances. The Aztec source, the Florentine Codex, captures the terror these animals inspired. The horses, the deer neighed. There was much neighing and they would sweat a great deal. The flecks of foam splattered on the ground like soap suds. As they went, they made a beating, throbbing, and hoof-pounding like throwing stones. Despite this, the Tlaxcalans fought with incredible ferocity, even managing to kill 2 of the Spanish horses. Diaz claims they even hacked the head off one of the animals with their glass-edged swords. Ultimately, however, the Tlaxcalans saw the futility of their assault. The resolve of their warriors broke and they fell back. Cortés and his men had won the battle, but the victory left him deeply demoralized. He had expected a warm welcome and instead was met with ferocious resistance. Many of his men were injured, and a few had been killed. If the Tlaxcalans could mount such a fierce defense, he wondered, how could they possibly hope to defeat the far more powerful Mexica? That night, his company camped beside a stream, still dangerously low on food. Yet Cortés remained determined to win the Tlaxcalans over. At dawn, he dispatched messengers to them, but his overtures were rejected. The Spaniards were forced to retreat to the summit of a nearby volcano called Tenochtitlan, where a small Mexica shrine stood. They made their camp there, and for days they fought off continuous attacks from the Tlaxcalans, who refused every offer of peace. Cortés's entire plan seemed to be unraveling, and many of his men must have feared they would never leave that mountaintop alive. But after 3 grueling days and nights of repelling attacks, a change occurred. The Tlaxcalans sent messengers to request peace, as Bernal Diaz remembered, making their sign of peace, which was to bow. With this apology, luck finally began turning in Cortés's favor. The events at Tlaxcala sent shockwaves through the Aztec world. Fewer than 300 Spanish soldiers had beaten back the full force of a notoriously powerful regional army. Chronicler Bernal Diaz recalls the effect this had, as Spanish fame and a great terror spread throughout the land, ultimately reaching the ears of Moctezuma himself. The powerful Prince of Mexico, now dreading their approach to his city, sent 5 high-ranking chieftains to their camp. They were tasked to bid the newcomers welcome, congratulate them on their stunning victory, and praise their remarkable fighting skill. These messengers, clearly sensing the danger, also issued a stark warning to Cortés: never trust the Tlaxcalans. They then relayed that Moctezuma would love to welcome him to Tenochtitlan, but that it was probably better if he didn't come. The roads were bad, they claimed, and food supplies in the capital had been very low recently. Moctezuma, they insisted, was only thinking of the Spaniards' comfort and didn't want them to suffer. After Melanson translated this speech, Cortés thanked Moctezuma for his thoughtful words. But he countered that he had no choice in the matter. His own king had ordered him to go to Tenochtitlan, and so he was obligated to go. Cortés would later tell one of his soldiers that he was absolutely delighted by this conversation. It confirmed that the Aztec lands were exactly as divided as he had hoped. He quoted a line from the Gospel of Mark, reflecting that upon seeing the discord between these two peoples, his purpose was furthered considerably, for a kingdom divided cannot stand. Soon after, Cortés and his men were welcomed into the city of Tlaxcala itself. For the next few weeks, the Spaniards recuperated from their difficult journey within the city of Tlaxcala. In a letter penned to King Charles V, Cortés boasted that Tlaxcala was a stunning metropolis, even grander than the Spanish city of Granada. He wrote, "The city is much larger than Granada and very much stronger, with as good buildings and many more people, and very much better supplied with the produce of the land." There was just one problem. Cortés had never set foot in Granada, making this another classic example of his penchant for bending the truth. The reality was that Tlaxcala was probably a struggling city, impoverished by a long-standing Mexica blockade that had crippled its economy. Still, understanding the crucial need to earn his new allies' trust, Cortés issued strict orders for his men to maintain impeccable conduct. They were forbidden from taking anything not freely given, and were instructed to stay clear of the city's sacred temple district. During their stay, their Tlaxcalan hosts showed them some extraordinary relics. As Bernal Diaz later wrote, the Tlaxcalans spoke of an ancient time when huge-boned men and women lived among them. To prove their story, they brought us the leg bone of one, which was very thick and the height of an ordinary-sized man. I measured myself against it, and it was as tall as I am. The Spanish were stunned, convinced that giants had once walked this land. In all likelihood, these were not the bones of giants, but the fossilized remains of mammoths that Neolithic hunters had pursued across the Valley of Mexico. It was clear the Tlaxcalans were beginning to trust their new guests, or at least they recognized the immense opportunity the Spanish presented. They soon proposed a new destination. Pointing the Spanish towards the nearby city of Calula, a major ally of Moctezuma, they made a grim warning which the Florentine Codex recorded. "The Calulans are very evil. They are our enemies. They are as strong as the Mexica, and they are the Mexica's friends." Once the Spaniards heard this, they prepared to march on Calula, joined by a contingent of Tlaxcalan warriors outfitted for battle. In truth, the Tlaxcalans were manipulating the Spanish. Calula's alliance with the Mexica wasn't nearly as strong as they claimed. Instead, an intense and long-standing rivalry festered between Tlaxcala and Caligula. Their relationship was defined by anger, fury, hate, and disgust, and they could agree on nothing. The Tlaxcalans were cunningly directing this new foreign power to eliminate a troublesome neighbor. This very act of deception seriously undermines the theory that the indigenous people viewed the Spaniards as infallible gods. You probably wouldn't try to hoodwink a divine being. Alarmed by the supposed threat, Cortés agreed to the plan. He led his forces toward Caligula, a prosperous city famous for its many tall towers and for being the site of the world's largest pyramid by volume. Upon the Spaniards' arrival, the Calulans came out to meet them in peace. But without warning, Cortés unleashed an absolute storm of violence. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies sealed all the exits to the main gathering area, trapping the Calulan nobles. According to one account, people were stabbed, struck, and killed. No such thing was in the minds of the Calulans. They did not meet the Spaniards with weapons of war. The slaughter raged for 2 days. The city was set ablaze, and in a deeply symbolic act, the Spanish razed the temple dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who was the chief deity of Caligula. If any lingering doubts remained about whether Cortés could be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, this brutal desecration surely ended them. The city's priests, seeking to escape the inferno, threw themselves from the tops of their burning temples. Later, Cortés invented a justification for his actions, claiming in his letters that he had uncovered a treacherous Calulan plot to ambush and murder his men. But the truth of this claim is highly questionable. It appears far more probable that this was a calculated and horrifying act of terror, designed to send a clear and bloody message. That message struck Moctezuma to the core. Just 80 kilometers remained between the invaders and the city of Tenochtitlan, which was nestled behind a formidable barrier of towering volcanoes. The final objective of Cortés's long march was now tantalizingly close. News of the brutal razing of the powerful city of Caligula, including the obliteration of its temple to Quetzalcoatl, left Moctezuma utterly devastated. The Florentine Codex records his reaction, noting that when the messengers arrived, they delivered a full account of the events they had witnessed. Upon hearing their report, the emperor could only lower his head and sit in absolute silence. He seemed like a man at death's door, and for an extended period, he appeared to be completely lost, as if his consciousness had fled. He eventually broke his silence, but only to voice his profound despair. "O men of unique valor, what is there to do?" he asked. "This is the end for us, we must accept it. Should we flee into the mountains? But where could we run? We are the Mexica. Could our state even survive in exile? Think of the heartbreaking state of the elderly, the women, and the innocent young children. Where could we possibly take them? There is no answer. What can be done? What is to be done?" A continuous procession of messengers now streamed into his palace. As one group left, another would arrive. With an informant stationed in every village along the route, Moctezuma received constant updates. The Spanish, however, delivered the identical religious lecture at each stop, leading the emperor to finally instruct his spies to cease relaying the repetitive sermon. He had heard more than enough. Every new message confirmed that the Spaniards were advancing ever nearer. Trailing in their wake was a massive force of thousands of indigenous fighters, primarily Tlaxcalans, but also including other groups like the Otomi. This growing army was swelled by warriors from cities on the far side of the mountains, including the people of Tlililcuaitepec and Huixotzinco. They arrived fully equipped for battle, wearing protective cotton armor and carrying shields and bows. Their quivers were stuffed with a variety of feathered arrows, some tipped with obsidian, some blunted, and others barbed. Moving in a low crouch, they cupped their hands over their mouths to amplify their war cries, singing in the traditional Toxcatlan style as they advanced. While their allies advanced with whistling war cries and shaking heads, news of the unstoppable approach raced back to Moctezuma. His messengers delivered the urgent report. The Spanish had reached the mountain passes and were poised to cross into the valley. They confirmed that the leader, Captain Cortés, was asking for the emperor by name. A wave of terror must have washed over the king. In his desperation, he conceived a plan to send a servant disguised in royal finery, carrying as much gold as could be quickly assembled. The hope was that by giving the invaders what they seemed to want, a meeting with Moctezuma and the gold they craved, they might finally be satisfied and leave his lands for good. The impersonator traveled to meet Cortés high in the pine-forested mountain passes. There, the Spaniards were presented with the gold, along with magnificent banners made from precious feathers and gleaming golden necklaces. Upon receiving these gifts, the foreigners' faces lit up. They smiled and rejoiced, their happiness obvious to the Mexica delegation. The disguised servant then introduced himself as Moctezuma and asked what business the Spanish had in their lands. But the deception was a complete failure. Cortés was not fooled in the slightest, thanks to his Tlaxcalan allies who, knowing the real emperor's appearance, immediately exposed the trick. They confronted the servant, asking why he would lie to them and what kind of fools he took them for, declaring that his attempts to fool or flatter them were useless. With the ruse shattered, the Spanish column marched onward. They continued their descent through the mountain passes, with massive volcanoes towering on either side and thousands of native allies following in their wake. For the Tlaxcalans, the atmosphere must have been absolutely electric. How many of them had only dreamed of this very day, when they would march into Mexica lands to bring vengeance upon their most hated enemy? When word reached Moctezuma that his ploy had failed, he fell into despair. By now, the news of the Spanish advance had spread throughout the region, causing widespread panic. People began to flee, and entire towns and villages were left deserted. A great silence fell over the land of Mexico. No one ventured outside, and mothers kept their children indoors. The roads were eerily empty, as if swept clean. In their homes, people could only gather and grieve. Moctezuma even ordered the roads to be blocked, but the Spanish overcame these simple obstacles with ease. Panic began to set in at the emperor's court. The magicians he had sent to stop the invaders with sorcery also returned, reporting that their spells had had no effect. Even more chilling, some of them claimed to have seen visions of the entire Aztec Empire, its temples, palaces, and homes going up in flames. This was likely the last thing Moctezuma wanted to hear. As despair gripped the capital, Cortés and his men were experiencing a moment of profound awe. Having finally crested the mountains, the vast expanse of the Valley of Mexico stretched out before them. It was the same breathtaking view the Mexica themselves had witnessed 200 years earlier when they first arrived from the other direction. About 15 kilometers away, the wide, blue waters of Lake Texcoco shimmered, its banks ringed by the white clusters of dozens of cities. The surrounding grasslands were a patchwork of fields growing corn, beans, and chili peppers, with smoke rising from villages across the landscape. And sitting in the middle of the lake was the glittering white jewel of Tenochtitlan. The closer the Spaniards marched, the more magnificent the city appeared. They were amazed at the sight, a spectacle later captured in the words of the soldier Francisco de Aguilar. He described the city's castellated fortresses, its incredible monuments, and the palaces of its kings. He marveled at the glorious heights and what a wonder they were to behold, with every surface stuccoed, carved, and topped with diverse decorations. Animal paintings and stone figures seemed to cover everything. It was with a profound sense of apprehension that they must have made their way towards the city's grand causeway. Awaiting them in the center of that very bridge stood a commanding figure. His head was adorned with a crown of vibrant green quetzal feathers, and warriors clad in the skins of jaguars and the feathers of eagles flanked him on both sides. It was none other than Emperor Moctezuma himself, who had at last emerged to greet the strangers. From his vantage point, Moctezuma had observed the Spaniards advance with pure horror. The Florentine Codex details just how intimidating and formidable they must have appeared to him. It describes how the Spaniards marched toward Mexico, clustered together in a tight formation that kicked up clouds of dust. A fearsome sparkle seemed to emanate from their iron lances and halberds, while their iron swords curved like flowing water. The sound of their armor and iron helmets clattering together was unmistakable. The Codex notes that some were encased entirely in iron, transforming them into gleaming, metallic beings who inspired immense fear and were viewed with absolute dread. A massive army of soldiers stood ready to defend Tenochtitlan. The city was home to the empire's entire military force, and every single man had been a student of war from his youth. There is a strong possibility that this army could have encircled the Spanish and crushed them, much as the Tlaxcalans had almost succeeded in doing. Yet, Moctezuma found himself frozen by fear. The tales of Tlaxcala's defeat and Calula's brutal sacking surely echoed in his mind. He understood that a failed attempt to defeat the Spaniards on his home turf, witnessed by all his subjects, would mean the end of his reign. A victory that came at a high price was equally out of the question. His final decision was to personally meet these foreigners and discover their purpose. Tremendous fear must have gripped Moctezuma as a litter carried him down to Tenochtitlan's causeway. He was dressed in his most magnificent attire, adorned with shimmering feathers, and escorted by his loyal warriors. Upon dismounting, he laid eyes on the Spaniards, who had started to make their way across the bridge to meet him. It's hard to truly grasp the gravity of the moment when these two men finally met in person. Neither leader was known for eloquent speeches. In fact, their initial conversation was remarkably brief, consisting of only this exchange: "Are you not him? Are you not Moctezuma?" To which the emperor replied, "Yes, I am him." Following this, Moctezuma formally welcomed the Spaniards, guiding them into his great city. Their accommodations were in a palace that had belonged to a previous ruler, a place Aguilar would later describe with glowing praise as a true wonder. The residence contained countless rooms, including antechambers and magnificent halls. For comfort, there were mattresses made from large cloaks and pillows fashioned from leather and tree fiber. Upon settling in, the Spanish celebrated by firing their guns and cannons. The thunderous reports echoed through the city's streets, sending the common Mexica people scrambling to hide in terror. That night, as Cortés and his men drifted off to sleep on beds scattered with fragrant flowers in the Aztec capital, the faint sound of conch shells blowing from the temples would have carried on the midnight air. Later, the rhythmic beating of drums would herald the coming of a new day. The subsequent weeks saw Cortés and his soldiers exploring Tenochtitlan. They took in the spectacle of the great market at Tlaxcala, a sight that Bernal Diaz recalled with pure amazement. He wrote that even soldiers who had traveled widely, seeing Constantinople, all of Italy, and Rome, had never witnessed a market square so impressive, orderly, expansive, and bustling with people. Their tour also included the city's towering Teotihuacan temples, where they observed with revulsion the stains of blood that coated the steps. Wasting little time, they began questioning Moctezuma about the location of his gold reserves. Feeling his grip on the situation slipping, the Aztec emperor surrendered his entire treasury to the foreign visitors. He presented them with exquisite pieces of carved jade, an offer the Spaniards flatly rejected. Their interest lay solely in the intricately decorated gold, which included jewelry, headbands, chest plates, statues, and countless other priceless works of art. The Spanish then built a great fire and unceremoniously melted every single piece into simple gold bars. All the gold was stripped from shields and other ceremonial devices. Once the gold was removed, they immediately burned what remained of the precious objects. Everything went into the flames, allowing the Spaniards to form the molten metal into bricks. They then fanned out, searching every nook and cranny, from hiding spots to storehouses. Anything they found that caught their eye, they took. There's a strong probability that what happened next was part of Cortés's plan all along. Yet, during those initial weeks following his arrival in Tenochtitlan, an event transpired that gave Cortés the perfect pretext to accelerate his plans. A report from the coast detailed how 6 of his men from the Vera Cruz garrison had been killed during a dispute with local Mexica. Though he likely knew it was an accident, Cortés saw a golden opportunity and decided to use the incident as his justification for moving against Emperor Moctezuma. The meeting began in a deceptively normal fashion. Cortés strode into the throne room with his soldiers, and Moctezuma offered them more jewels and other gifts. But this time, Cortés refused them. He leveled an accusation at the emperor, claiming he had masterminded the coastal attack on his men. The king was then ordered to accompany the Spanish to their lodgings, with a stern warning not to make any noise. A chilling realization must have washed over the Aztec ruler. His greatest fear was coming to pass. He pleaded with the Spaniards to reconsider, arguing, "My person is not such as can be made a prisoner of. Even if I would like it, my people would not suffer it. His entreaties were useless. Moctezuma then addressed his courtiers, concocting a story that the great god Huitzilopochtli had commanded him to go and live with the Spanish for a time. One can only imagine the stunned expressions of these powerful men as they processed his words. Many chiefs then removed their garments, took the emperor by his arms, and weeping, carried him barefoot on a simple litter. They proceeded in profound silence to the Spanish quarters, with no disturbance rippling through the city. From that moment, it would have been unmistakable to everyone, from the highest noble to the commoner in the street, that Moctezuma was now an emperor in name only. The true power in the Aztec Empire was Cortés. That very night, he arrested 17 Mexica lords, accusing them of plotting the attacks at Vera Cruz. He had them burned alive inside the great temple's courtyard, using piles of the Aztecs' own wooden swords as kindling for the pyre. Moctezuma, with chains on his feet, was brought out to watch the horrific spectacle. It's said the Mexica people witnessed these executions in absolute silence. For the most part, Moctezuma appeared to endure his imprisonment with a mixture of dignity and resignation. His daily routines continued as usual. He watched jugglers and poets, he continued to bathe, and he met with his lords. But Spanish guards now shadowed him everywhere he went. Then a dramatic turn came one day in April 1520, when a messenger managed to secretly deliver the king a note painted on a piece of cloth. It showed 18 Spanish ships off the coast. To Moctezuma, the meaning was crystal clear. Another group of Spaniards was arriving, and they were not allies of Cortés. The governor of Cuba, Diego de Velázquez, had spent the 6 months since Cortés's departure stewing in bitterness. While he had confiscated much of Cortés's property and land back in Cuba, this did little to satisfy his hunger for revenge. When word reached him of what Cortés had done, sending reports of his conquests and chests full of gold directly to the Spanish king, he must have been incandescent with rage. In response to this fury, the governor gave a direct order to one of his lieutenants, Panfilo de Narvaez. Narvaez was tasked with assembling a force of 900 men and sailing for Mexico. His instructions were clear: find Cortés, shut down his unauthorized expedition, and transport him back to Cuba as a prisoner. Completely oblivious to this looming threat was Cortés himself. For Moctezuma, however, the news of this new Spanish force was a game-changer. He had watched as Cortés masterfully exploited the internal conflicts of the Aztec world, turning different groups against each other to weaken the empire. But now, Moctezuma suddenly realized that these foreign invaders were just as fractured by their own internal rivalries. This crucial insight presented a golden opportunity to finally be free of the merciless Cortés. A secret line of communication was established, with Moctezuma sending clandestine messages to Narvaez while his fleet moved along the coast. Narvaez revealed that Cortés had been deceiving the emperor all along, confirming he was not acting on behalf of the Spanish king, and that his men were essentially rogue outlaws. In his return messages, Moctezuma urged Narvaez to advance with all speed, providing him with detailed directions to Tenochtitlan and offering gifts of provisions and treasure. Yet with each passing day, Moctezuma's fear grew that his secret plotting would be discovered. Perhaps thinking he could frighten the Conquistador into leaving, he approached Cortés directly. He presented a cloth painting depicting the newly arrived Spanish ships and strongly advised him to flee the city before it was too late. The reaction from Cortés was surely one of pure fury. He stood at the very center of the empire he aimed to claim, with his plans unfolding perfectly, only for the resentful governor of Cuba to threaten his entire enterprise. Cortés understood he had no choice but to march the 400 kilometers back to the coast and confront this new rival. The problem was, he needed to leave a contingent of his soldiers in the city to maintain their hold on Emperor Moctezuma. As Bernal Diaz recalls, this decision would dangerously divide his already small army, putting everything he had accomplished at risk. According to Diaz, upon seeing the painting, Cortés grew deeply pensive, instantly recognizing that the ships had been dispatched by his nemesis, Governor Diego Velázquez. In early May, Cortés departed with a force of roughly 80 soldiers, entrusting the capital and his royal prisoner to the slightly more than 100 men who remained. His troops had adopted local Aztec cotton armor for the march, finding it much lighter and more manageable than their own steel, while also being remarkably efficient at absorbing arrow impacts. A messenger was dispatched to the Tlaxcalans with a request from Cortés for 4,000 warriors. However, given their brutal first encounter with the Spanish, the Tlaxcalans had little appetite for another battle involving these foreigners. Their response was not an army, but a diplomatic gift of 20 turkeys. Meanwhile, Narvaez had made landfall and was advancing along the coast, his first objective being the settlement of Vera Cruz. His army made camp in the town of Sempola, setting up their position atop a local temple to await the arrival of Cortés, brimming with an unshakable belief in their inevitable victory. With a force 3 times the size of his rivals, Narvaez assumed it would take Cortés a considerable amount of time to traverse the difficult Mexican terrain. He was completely caught off guard when one of his soldiers reported that Cortés's small army was already just 5 kilometers away. Unwilling to accept the report, he convinced himself that Cortés would surely wait for daylight to begin any assault, perhaps even anticipating a surrender. But Cortés's year-long experience in Mexico had taught him how to wage war in this new environment and stack the odds in his own favor. As a torrential downpour began that night, his men used the cover of darkness and the sound of the rain to advance. At midnight, while Narvaez slept, they crept forward, stealthily scaled the pyramid, and eliminated the guards posted outside Narvaez's quarters, torching the temple as they advanced. Narvaez finally raised the alarm, sending his men scrambling from their beds to don their armor. Their approach was so swift that by the time the alarm was sounded, Cortés was already in the courtyard with his men ascending the tower where Narvaez had stationed himself with some 19 cannons. The attackers charged up the steps with such speed that the defenders only managed to fire a single shot. The ensuing battle raged up and down the pyramid steps, with the flash of clashing swords illuminated by moonlight and the flames of the burning temple, all under the continuing deluge. During the chaos, a pikeman under Cortés's command thrust his weapon at Narvaez, taking out his right eye. Gushing blood down his face, Narvaez immediately gave up and was promptly put in chains. His soldiers, who were mercenaries promised gold for their service, felt no deep-seated allegiance to him. They surrendered as well, and after Cortés promised them unimaginable wealth in Tenochtitlan, they eagerly switched sides to join his cause. Bernal Diaz later recalled how Cortés's promises to make them rich were so effective that every single man agreed to join the expedition. He believed, however, that had they understood the true might of the Mexica, not one of them would have so willingly volunteered. In a stroke of incredible irony, the governor of Cuba's attempt to defeat Cortés had instead delivered him a fresh army. More powerful than he had ever been, Cortés immediately made plans to march back to Tenochtitlan. He had no way of knowing that, in his absence, the situation in the city had spiraled into darkness. He had left a man named Pedro de Alvarado in command, who continued to hold Moctezuma prisoner while the emperor carried on with his duties. Alvarado's position, however, was extremely fragile. With only about 100 Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies, he was attempting to control a sprawling metropolis with a population of well over 200,000 people. The Spaniards' precarious hold on the city would soon be tested to its absolute limit by the festival of Toxcatl. Originally, the Toxcatl ceremony was a ritual meant to bring rain to the Mexica lands. However, like many celebrations in Tenochtitlan, it had been repurposed during Tlaxcal's era to honor the warlike god Huitzilopochtli. The festival's centerpiece now involved the sacrifice of a young man who was selected for his exceptional charm and good looks. For an entire year, this chosen individual lived as the god Tezcatlipoca, lavished with every conceivable luxury. But on this day, his time was up. He would be dressed in divine attire, and his life would be offered up to the gods. Before departing for the coast, Moctezuma had secured Cortés's permission for the festival, but it came with one strict condition: there could be no human sacrifice. Now, with Cortés away, his second-in-command, Alvarado, began to see growing signs of rebellion. The Mexica sensed weakness in the Spanish command. They cut off the food supply to the occupiers, and a local girl who had been washing their clothes was discovered murdered, a clear warning to any other Mexica against collaborating with the foreigners. Alvarado even caught wind of rumors that the Mexica were planning to storm the palace to rescue the captive Moctezuma, possibly by scaling or even tunneling through the walls. These fears were undoubtedly amplified by the Spaniards' Tlaxcalan allies, whose deep-seated hatred for the Mexica made them eager to stoke such rumors. Trouble was undeniably brewing in Tenochtitlan, and on the third night of the festival, it was all about to explode. The ceremony itself would have been a spectacular display of color, movement, and sound. According to the Florentine Codex, the Mexica adorned themselves in vibrant embroidered clothes and feathered headdresses, singing sacred songs as they danced. As the celebration unfolded and the singing intensified, the chorus of voices was said to resemble the sound of waves crashing against rocks. But as the festival progressed, it became increasingly apparent that the Mexica had no intention of following Cortés's order and planned to carry out the sacrifice. Alvarado grew enraged at this open defiance and commanded his men to put a stop to the ceremony. The Spaniards, clad in full armor, marched into the sacred precinct while others guarded every exit. It's uncertain what precisely motivated Alvarado in that moment. It's quite possible that he and his men were drunk. But as the music of drums and flutes reached its climax, Alvarado issued a cold, clear command: let them die. A horrific slaughter began as the Spanish soldiers descended upon the unprepared Mexica. Memories of this event, recorded in the Florentine Codex, are filled with the kind of gruesome and specific details that speak to authentic trauma. The account describes how the killers moved through the courtyard on foot, armed with metal swords and shields. They surrounded the dancers, hacking at a drummer's arms until both hands were severed before striking his neck, sending his head flying far away. They ran people through with iron lances and slashed them with swords, striking some in the belly so their entrails spilled out. They split open the heads of others, cutting their skulls into little pieces. Some were hit on the shoulders, their bodies ripping open. A stench like sulfur filled the air as those trying to flee found themselves with nowhere to go. In a frenzy of destruction, the Spaniards then began to loot and burn the city's temples. This single act of brutality turned the entire city against them. The people of Tenochtitlan saw their chance to reclaim their freedom. War drums began to beat from the tops of the great temples, and a priest was heard crying out, "Mexica, are we not going to war? Have courage!" Immediately, soldiers and commoners alike grabbed their weapons and poured into the streets. The Spanish were driven back to the palace, where they barricaded themselves inside with Moctezuma and their Tlaxcalan allies. The Mexica swarmed the palace, attempting to burn down the doors. Fearing a breach, Alvarado pressed his dagger to Moctezuma's chest and forced him to address the crowd. Moctezuma climbed to the palace roof, raised his hands, and called out, "Let the Mexica hear, we are not their match. Please stop the fighting." In response, they hurled stones at him, forcing the Spanish to protect him with their shields. It was devastatingly clear that Moctezuma's authority was gone, and with it, any power the Spanish held over the city. Alvarado and his men were now trapped, settling in for a siege without food and under constant attack, just waiting for Cortés to come back. It took 23 days, but Cortés finally returned to the shores of Lake Texcoco, his army now significantly larger with the addition of Narvaez's men. He now commanded around 1,000 Spaniards, along with several thousand more Tlaxcalan warriors who had joined him on the journey back. The Tlaxcalans had heard of the uprising, but at this point they had wagered everything on Cortés. They knew that if the Spanish were defeated, the vengeance of the Mexica would be swift and terrible. The fates of the Spaniards and the Tlaxcalans were now inextricably linked. But Cortés had a new problem. To his fresh recruits, he had spun tales of a glittering golden city on a lake, filled with luxurious markets and an abundance of food. The Tenochtitlan he returned to was a grim shadow of that promise. The bodies of Mexica who had collaborated with the Spanish were hanging from gates and towers. The streets were eerily empty, and the great markets were shut down. Disgruntled murmurs began to spread among his new soldiers. Inside the palace, Cortés found Alvarado and the garrison on the brink of starvation. They received him with overwhelming joy, celebrating as though their lives, which they had considered lost, had been given back to them. Yet, despite the reunion, the city was still in full-scale revolt. Every day, crowds battered the palace walls, trying to break through. Cortés ordered Moctezuma to once again go out and speak to his people. The emperor, remembering the last time he tried, initially refused, but he was left with no choice. He stepped out onto the palace terrace, where a vast crowd stretched out below. 17 years earlier, a similar crowd had watched his magnificent coronation. Now, however, their faces were hard, unforgiving, and filled with rage. The reception for their captive king was a far cry from the celebratory sounds of his coronation. Historical accounts describe the Mexica people greeting him with a profound and chilling silence. Over the sea of grim faces, Moctezuma's voice rang out, delivering the same message he had before. Surrendering was the only option. "We are not their match," he pleaded. "Let there be no more fighting." A specific account, the Codex Ramirez, even details the moment an Aztec warrior from the crowd allegedly hurled insults back. What is being said by this scoundrel Moctezuma, whore of the Spaniards? Does he think he can call to us, with his woman-like soul, to fight for the empire which he has abandoned out of fright? We do not want to obey him because he is no longer our king. While the authenticity of this exact quote is debated, there is no doubt it perfectly captured the crowd's furious sentiment. Moments later, the hostile silence shattered. What started as a single projectile quickly became a hailstorm of rocks, with the entire crowd pelting their vulnerable king as arrows also began to fly. He sustained multiple injuries before his Spanish captors could intervene and drag him back to the safety of the palace, where a defeated Moctezuma then rejected all attempts to treat his wounds. His death came on the morning of June 30th, 1520, and according to the Florentine Codex, the Spanish proceeded to cremate his body. The Codex provides a vivid description of the event. They hastened to take Moctezuma up in their arms and brought him to the place called Capalco. Then they placed him on a pile of wood and set fire to it, ignited it. Then the fire crackled and roared with many tongues of flame like tassels rising up, and Moctezuma's body lay sizzling. It let off a stench as it burned. For Cortés, this was a critical turning point. He understood that remaining in Tenochtitlan was no longer an option, as his royal puppet and primary tool for controlling the Mexica was now gone. At the same time, the city's warriors were adapting their tactics, becoming adept at using the unique urban landscape against the invaders, a fact noted by Bernal Diaz, who recalls that if at times this very tactic, with Mexica warriors feigning retreats to set deadly traps, while an endless barrage of rocks and stones from the rooftops wounded his men, convinced Cortés he had to act. He concocted a desperate plan to escape the city under the cloak of night. The goal was to move silently through the streets while the city slept and make their way across the Western Causeway. It was a perilous gamble. The city's unique geography of interconnected islands featured a series of drawbridges, which the Mexica could raise at any time to trap and surround the Spanish forces. Preparing for the flight, Cortés and his soldiers packed their bags with all the gold they could manage and muffled the hooves of their horses to prevent any sound on the stone streets. As they prepared to depart, a midnight mist was settling over the lake. At first, their gambit was a success. They snuck from the palace, moving like ghosts through the dark, quiet avenues of the city. Their luck abruptly ended, however, when a woman near the docks spotted them and cried out a warning. "Mexica, come quickly. Our enemies are leaving. Now that it's night, they are running away as fugitives." In an instant, the entire male population of Tenochtitlan erupted from their homes, seizing their spears and swords and pouring into their war canoes. As Bernal Diaz would later write, the air filled with the shouts, cries, and whistles of the Mexicans. Suddenly, the lake was so thick with canoes, and the causeway so crowded with descending warriors that the Spanish found it impossible to defend themselves. While the Spanish were nearly invincible on open ground with their horses and cannons, they were tragically vulnerable here. In the city's narrow streets and on causeways broken by canals, the Aztecs knew precisely how to leverage their home advantage. They swarmed the Spanish in their canoes, pelting them with innumerable arrows, while warriors on foot charged them from the rear. The Mexica's hatred for the invaders had grown so profound that they cast aside their usual code of honor in warfare. They no longer sought to capture Europeans for sacrifice, but instead moved directly in for the kill. A telling detail of their fury is that they killed Spaniards with a sharp blow to the back of the head, a punishment typically reserved for petty criminals. Absolute chaos descended. The canals soon became choked with the bodies of dead Spaniards and Mexica alike, and it is said that the last of the retreating soldiers were forced to cross the gaps in the causeway by running across the floating corpses. Horses tumbled into the lake, and legend holds that many of the Spanish, weighed down by the gold they refused to abandon, also fell in and sank to the bottom. In their panicked flight, the Spanish lost almost all their treasure. For perhaps the first time, a crippling fear overcame them, turning their retreat into a complete rout. The human and material cost was staggering. Many had perished along with their horses, and all the gold had been lost together with the jewels, clothing, all the artillery, and many other things besides. One survivor recalled the sheer danger. God alone knows how difficult it was, for each time I turned on the enemy, I came back full of arrows and bruised by stones. A reasonable estimate suggests around 600 Spaniards were killed that night, alongside thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies. Just over 400 Spaniards, Cortés included, successfully fought their way across the causeway to safety. Cortés was devastated. It said he sat beneath a tree and wept, but this crushing defeat only fortified his determination, pushing him to a state that bordered on madness. He vowed to reconquer the city of Tenochtitlan from what he now labeled the Mexica Rebellion. His mindset is revealed by the only question he asked that night. He checked to see if the expedition's chief shipbuilder was still alive. Upon hearing that the man had survived, Cortés replied with chilling resolve, "Let's go then. We have everything we need." The people of Tenochtitlan had delivered the most crushing defeat ever inflicted on European colonists in the New World. This event, known to the Spanish as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows, would hold that distinction for some time. The victorious Mexica gathered the hundreds of Spanish bodies, stripping them of their steel armor and swords. They also took crossbows, though these were difficult to use without training, and captured several guns, which were useless without bullets and powder. They even recovered a Spanish cannon, which they wisely rolled into the lake. Despite their joyous victory, the damage to the Mexican Empire was already immense. The emperor was dead, and several parts of the empire were now openly defying Tenochtitlan's authority. The entire network of Aztec power was beginning to unravel. Cortés, by this point a man possessed, retreated to his allies in Tlaxcala. He spent the next 6 months readying his return, gathering an army of native allies that may have numbered as many as 100,000. With his remaining 100 cavalry, 900 Spanish infantry, and 16 cannons, he marched back toward the city that had so violently expelled him. By Christmas of 1520, Cortés rallied his men with a powerful speech. He reminded them that the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan had, without any just cause, rebelled against the Spanish crown, slaughtering their friends and kinsmen before driving them from the land. He framed the coming campaign as a righteous mission to serve both God and their king, by recovering everything that had been lost. The chronicler Bernal Diaz recorded that the Spanish, mindful of their devastating expulsion, had resolved to change their entire approach. Vowing to succeed, they would abandon a direct assault for a new strategy, a complete blockade of the city. Upon reaching the Great Lake, the shipwright that Cortés had specifically requested during the Noche Triste began his vital task. He instructed the soldiers to harvest pine trees from the slopes of the nearby volcanoes to construct 12 specialized warships called brigantines. These were nimble, two-masted vessels powered by both sails and oars. As the fleet took shape, Cortés had them armed with cannons and filled with musketeers. He then initiated the blockade, sealing off all major causeways connecting Tenochtitlan to the mainland. While the Tepanec king Maxtla had tried a similar tactic nearly a century before, Cortés's powerful warships made his siege far more effective. For 4 long months, his forces methodically choked the life from the island capital. During this time, a horrific new factor came into play: the rapid spread of smallpox. This European disease, to which the Mexica had no immunity, caused unimaginable devastation. The Florentine Codex describes how an epidemic of pustules erupted. Large, agonizing bumps spread across people's bodies, covering their faces, heads, and chests. The sickness brought complete desolation, killing a vast number of people. Survivors were often too weak to even move, confined to their sleeping mats, unable to stir. As the siege dragged on, Cortés finally commanded his forces to push forward into the city, launching an assault across its three great causeways. The combat that followed was a brutal, merciless affair, a slow grind for every street, house, and bridge that inflicted staggering casualties on both armies. Bernal Diaz later recalled the terrifying soundscape of these battles. An endless chorus of shouts and yells from Mexica captains directing their men in canoes filled the air, day and night. Layered over this was the unceasing sound of their accursed drums and trumpets, with a mournful, melancholy beat echoing from the shrines and temple towers. The din grew so overwhelming, Diaz noted, that soldiers could scarcely hear the person next to them speak. Amid this brutal fighting, the Mexica began to deploy sacrifice as a potent weapon of terror. Any Spanish soldiers they were able to capture were hauled to the top of the temple dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, all within the full view of their comrades fighting below. In a horrifying spectacle, the captives' hearts were torn from their chests before their bodies were dismembered. As Bernal Diaz recounted, this tactic had a profoundly terrifying effect on the Spanish troops. He confessed his own fear that he would one day suffer the same fate. "When I remembered their hideous deaths," he wrote, "I came to fear death more than ever in the past." He admitted that before he entered a battle, a sort of horror and gloom would seize my heart. The incredible resilience and bravery of the Aztecs pushed Cortés to resort to even more extreme measures. He ordered his men to completely demolish every district they passed through as they advanced. The rubble from these raised buildings was then used to fill in the canals and waterways, a tactic designed to prevent the maneuverable Aztec canoes from operating. In effect, the Spanish army was a steamroller, slowly and methodically crushing the city of Tenochtitlan into dust. This was a frustrating and angering outcome for Cortés, who had hoped to present the city to his king as a pristine jewel, but was instead reducing it to a blackened ruin. Yet, while the Spanish adapted, the Mexica did as well. The Florentine Codex mentions that they learned to execute evasive maneuvers in their canoes and to take cover from incoming gunfire. Having learned to dodge Spanish cannon and crossbow fire, the Mexica quickly adapted their tactics. They abandoned moving in straight lines, instead adopting erratic, zigzagging patterns. The moment they saw a large cannon being prepared to fire, warriors would instantly drop to the ground or scatter for cover among the city's houses. Their cleverness extended to the water, where they managed to bait Cortés's large ships onto submerged sandbanks. This stranded the vessels, allowing Mexica warriors to attack and kill their commanders. Across the entire siege, a total of 5 Spanish ships were lost this way. At night, under the cloak of darkness, the city's defenders would creep out to clear the rubble that the Spanish had dumped into the canals, systematically undoing the day's work. But despite these acts of defiance, the grinding months of siege warfare slowly broke the city's spirit. Famine and disease began to decimate the Mexica. According to the Florentine Codex, they resorted to eating wood, leather, and even bricks crushed into powder. The suffering among the common people was immense. Starvation claimed countless lives, and their water supply became a source of death. With no access to pure water, they were forced to drink the salty lake water, which triggered widespread dysentery that killed many more. The Codex records a harrowing list of what they were forced to consume: lizards, swallows, maize straw, and salt-flat grasses. They roasted and toasted deerskin and leather to make it edible and chewed on plaster, wood, and even flowers. They ground up adobe bricks and medicinal herbs simply for something to eat. The account describes the suffering as unprecedented, a terrifying siege where hunger whittled down their numbers as the Spanish pressed them into an ever smaller corner of their city. When the Spanish finally penetrated the city center, they located the last well of fresh water and destroyed it, a cruel act that sealed the defenders' fate. Spanish accounts from the time express astonishment at how the Mexica could endure such misery, noting that the streets were so littered with the dead they were forced to walk upon the bodies. Though the Aztecs fought with incredible bravery and inflicted huge casualties, the final outcome was never in doubt. They were completely cut off from new supplies, fresh soldiers, or any hope of relief. Meanwhile, Cortés received a steady flow of provisions from the coast. On numerous occasions when his men were about to run out of gunpowder or food, a resupply ship would arrive the very next day. Soon, the remaining Aztec warriors were cornered in the great market of Tlatelolco for their last stand. The Florentine Codex recalls that on this final day, a strange fire appeared in the sky, looking like a whirlwind. It spun and crackled, exploding into sparks and embers as it circled the city walls before plunging into the lake and vanishing. The Mexica watched this omen in absolute silence. In that same market, once the vibrant heart of the empire, the last of the Aztec forces were surrounded and annihilated. The Mexica, under their final king Cuauhtemoc, surrendered on the 13th of August, 1521. The profound sorrow of that moment is palpable in the Florentine Codex, which describes the people weeping as their captured king was led away in a boat. The Aztec calendar marked the day of defeat, when the weapons were laid down, as the year 3 House and the day 1 Serpent. The surviving warriors marked their city's fall by singing a bitter lament, a poem of roofless houses with blood-reddened walls, of broken spears in the roads, and of worms swarming in the plazas. "We have pounded our hands in despair," they sang, "for our inheritance, our city, is lost and dead. The shields of our warriors were its defense, but they could not save it." The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtemoc, was tortured by the Spanish to reveal the location of the city's remaining gold. But there was very little left, as most of it had been lost in the lake during the retreat of the previous year. This enraged Cortés's men, who had been promised vast riches. Bernal Diaz later wrote of their shared gloom, recalling how sad the soldiers were when we saw how little gold there was and how poor and mean our shares would be. Cortés and his men stood victorious over the smoking ruins of Tenochtitlan. Humiliated by his failure to capture the magnificent city intact, he resolved to erase every trace of it and its culture. Over the following years, he oversaw the systematic demolition of every remaining structure, pulling down houses and filling in canals. He even erected a gallows in the main plaza, declaring that any Mexica who tried to move back into the ruined city would be executed. He enslaved vast numbers of the survivors, branding them with hot irons. He then forced them to carry out the heartbreaking work of tearing down their own city to build a new, European-style one on its foundations, working thousands to death in the process. The great pyramids and temples were dismantled, with Catholic churches built on their rubble. Moctezuma's palaces were torn down to make way for Spanish mansions. Even the name was changed. Tenochtitlan became Mexico, a word the Spanish found easier to pronounce. The new city was built on a grid system, obliterating the unique shape of the metropolis beneath. The Franciscan friar Toribio de Benavent Montalinia, who arrived 4 years later, witnessed this army of enslaved Mexica disassembling their own great city and described the hellish scene as a plague on all mankind. During the siege, the Spanish had destroyed the dams that protected the city from floods, and in the 1600s, an effort began to drain Lake Texcoco completely. The goal was to reveal fertile farmland, but the lakebed was too salty, leaving behind only stagnant salt flats. Still, Mexico City expanded across this barren ground at a tremendous rate. Today, it is the largest city by population in North America, and the vast expanse of Lake Texcoco has been paved over, ceasing to exist. With the fall of its capital, the Aztec Empire collapsed entirely. The Spanish did their best to eradicate its culture, with religious orders flooding into Mexico to convert the population. They burned any Aztec books they could find, and today, only 16 pre-contact codices survive. The Spanish did, however, co-opt the existing Aztec social structure, using the system of local lords to create a colonial hierarchy for extracting taxes and labor. Coupled with diseases like smallpox, which killed up to 95% of the indigenous population, the people's will to resist was crushed. And yet, echoes of the Aztec world remain. The Nahuatl language is still spoken by nearly 2 million people in Mexico. Several of its words, like avocado, chili, tomato, coyote, and chocolate, live on in English. The name of an Aztec god even resurfaced in a surprising place. The enormous pterodactyl Quetzalcoatlus was named for the feathered serpent of legend. The other major players in this story met varied fates. Diego Velázquez, Cortés's nemesis in Cuba, was briefly dismissed from his post but reinstated in 1523. He died a year later at 59, known as the richest Spaniard in the Americas, never having forgiven Cortés. Panfilo de Narvaez, the man sent to arrest Cortés, was released after 2 years, missing an eye. He later led a disastrous expedition to Florida, where nearly all 600 of his men perished. Narvaez himself drowned at sea. Melanson, Cortés's translator, gave birth to his son and later married one of his soldiers. She moved to Spain, where she was received at court and became a Spanish lady of high society, never speaking of her early life. As for Hernán Cortés, after destroying an empire in 2 years, he spent the rest of his life chasing the glory of that victory, a glory he would never find again. He alternated between restless adventuring and the life of a wealthy magnate running silver mines, but neither satisfied him. Though celebrated in Spain, his fame made the nobility distrust him, and by 1541 he found himself shunned by the aristocracy. In one famous incident, he forced his way to the king's carriage, and when the unrecognized monarch asked who he was, Cortés angrily replied, "I am a man who has given you more provinces than your ancestors left you cities." But it was no use. His insatiable appetite for expeditions bankrupted him, and a request for a loan from the crown went unanswered. Cortés died in Seville on December 2, 1547, at the age of 62 from pleurisy. He died in pain, short of breath, clutching his chest. One has to wonder if he recalled telling Moctezuma's messenger that he and his men had a disease of the heart that only gold could cure. Embittered and alone, his restless nature seemed to follow him in death. His bones were moved 8 times over the subsequent centuries, from Spain to Mexico. In the 19th century, as Mexican nationalism grew, Cortés was recast from hero to monster, and the marker on his tomb was hidden for fear of vandalism. Finally, his remains came to rest in the Church of Jesus Nazareno in Mexico City, a 15-minute walk from where the Great Temple was discovered. The area is now a chaotic hub of traffic and markets. The grave itself is marked only by a small orange plaque with his name and dates. Today, it receives few visitors. A Mexica poet once wrote, "The earth is only a place of forgetfulness. In the end, only our songs, our flowers, will be remembered."